It was February of 1941 when a single general's arrival in North Africa set in motion one of history's most quietly instructive defeats. General Erwin Rommel stepped off a transport plane near Tripoli on a morning already thick with heat, carrying with him a reputation for audacity and a command that would come to embody a single, unavoidable truth, that in warfare it is not always the cleverest tactics or the most daring maneuver that decides the victor. Sometimes it is simply the weight of distance, the capacity of a harbour, the number of ships that can cross a sea without being sunk, and the arithmetic of how many tons of fuel and food and ammunition a desert can swallow in a day. Before Rommel arrived, the Italian campaign in Libya had begun to collapse. The British had driven Italian forces back across hundreds of miles, and Rome, desperate to prevent a total loss of North Africa, had turned to Berlin for rescue. Hitler, who had his eyes on the Soviet Union and regarded the Mediterranean almost as a sideshow, nonetheless authorized sending a small expeditionary force. What few understood at that moment was that this decision would unlock a struggle unlike any other in the Second World War, not a contest won on a battlefield under an open sky, but rather a war fought in convoy lanes, in port facilities, on the decks of merchant ships, and in the calculations of quartermasters studying maps of fuel depots scattered across a landscape so vast and so empty that every mile eastward became heavier, costlier, and more fatal. If you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that unfolds not through grand speeches and charging armies, but through the quiet mathematics of logistics, through the stories of truck drivers and dock workers and sailors who never fired a shot, but whose labor determined everything, then I invite you to follow this history of the Afrika Korps Supply War across many nights. Subscribe to Fall Asleep 2 for the complete chronicle of Rommel's losing battle, a campaign that teaches us how distance itself can be an enemy no less formidable than any opponent with a gun. For now, picture that moment. The year is 1941, early in the morning, perhaps just before the sun has cleared the coast entirely. A German convoy sits cooling in the sand not far from Tripoli's harbour. The trucks are relatively small by the standards of what will later be needed. Opel Blitz vehicles mostly, six-wheeled and sturdy, designed for European roads but now laden with supplies for a campaign in a desert no German soldier had seen before. The engines tick as they cool. The sand, which has already begun to work its way into every bearing and piston, carries with it the smell of the Mediterranean. Salt from the crossing, the ghosts of ships that made the passage from Italy, the remnants of those that did not make it at all. Around these trucks move men in uniform still somewhat unfamiliar with the climate. Some have removed their tunics, others stand in small clusters, surveying the landscape before them, the vast interior of Libya stretching away to the south and east, flat and undulating, broken here and there by low rocky outcrops called Jebel. To the north lies the sea, and beyond that, Italy, and further north still, Europe. But the men's attention, if they could have allowed themselves to think beyond the immediate demands of the morning, might have fixed on something invisible but already pressing, a question that would pursue them for the next 3 years, that would eventually wear them down, not through combat, but through attrition, through the simple and relentless mathematics of insufficient supplies traveling too slowly across too great a distance. How far could an army advance into a desert when every gallon of fuel, every can of water, every round of ammunition had to be brought in by truck across hundreds of miles? How much could be brought, how quickly, and what would be lost along the way to mechanical failure, enemy action, and the sheer exhausting demand of keeping machines and men alive in a landscape that seemed almost designed to destroy both? These questions were not yet urgent in February of 1941. Rommel had arrived with clear orders: hold the line, prevent further British advances, restore German and Italian prestige in North Africa. He had brought with him the first elements of what would become the Afrika Korps, the German expeditionary force. It was small by the standards of what Europe would soon witness in the Soviet Union. Perhaps a few thousand men initially, growing eventually to perhaps 100,000 at its height, never more than a fraction of the armies contending in other theatres. But even this small force had to be fed, armed, supplied and deployed across a region where the nearest friendly port lay nearly 1,000 miles away, and where the sea itself had become a contested space, prowled by British submarines and aircraft operating from Malta, an island so small and so ordinary-looking that few understood how completely it was reshaping the war in the Mediterranean. The harbour at Tripoli, visible from where those trucks stood cooling in the early morning, was the first and most crucial answer to the question of supply. It was not a particularly modern or efficient port. The facilities were modest. The capacity to unload ships was limited by the number of cranes, by the skills of the Italian dock workers who performed much of the labour, by the simple fact that only so many vessels could tie up alongside the quays at any one time. Every ship that arrived from Italy had to be unloaded quickly and carefully. Every day it sat in harbour was a day when it could not make another run across the sea. Every ton of cargo that had to be offloaded by hand, by crane, by the sweat and coordination of workers who had never trained for this kind of intensity, represented an entire chain of logistics beginning to fracture somewhere along its length. And yet, in those early weeks and months, there was something almost manageable about it. The distances were long, yes, but Rommel's force was still relatively small. The sea crossing from Italy to Libya was only about 200 miles in some places, a journey that could be made in a single night if one had fast ships and did not encounter enemies. The British were not yet, in early 1941, conducting the kind of coordinated air and naval assault on Axis shipping that would later become almost routine. Malta, that island fortress to the north, was not yet fully blockaded and reinforced. The war at sea in the Mediterranean was still in a state of flux, still open to possibility. What this opening window of time, these first few weeks and months, allowed was the arrival of supplies without yet catastrophic loss. Trucks came inland from Tripoli, carrying fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, water. The German soldiers and the Italian forces beside them began to organize themselves. The heat was intense, yes. The sand was invasive and corrosive, yes. But there was not yet the sense of absolute scarcity. The supply situation was merely tight. The margins were merely narrow. The rope was merely taut, not yet stretched to breaking point. In the cool early morning, with the trucks resting and the sea breeze carrying salt and the smell of diesel fuel and human exhaustion, it might have seemed that this balance could be maintained, that an army could advance into a desert, fight battles, capture ground, and survive on supplies that reached it across those long distances, that perhaps this would be a quick campaign, a rapid restoration of Axis fortunes, and then a withdrawal to sustainable positions. It was not to be, but the Axis forces in North Africa did not yet understand that. They stood in the morning sun, in the shadow of trucks, facing toward the interior of a continent that would slowly and inexorably defeat them, not through the tactical brilliance of their enemies, but through the simple, undeniable arithmetic of logistics. The story of that arithmetic, of that slow defeat written in empty fuel tanks and abandoned vehicles and supply depots that never quite contained enough, begins in places like Tripoli harbour, where ships arrived carrying the promise of sustenance, and where every ounce that could not be carried forward into the desert became a harbinger of everything that would eventually go wrong. The Mediterranean in 1941 was not one theatre, but a series of contests layered atop one another, each one invisible to the casual observer, each one absolutely essential. To understand what would unfold across the coming 3 years in the desert, one must first understand the geography that would strangle every ambition, that would turn brilliant tactics into exhausted marches, and that would ultimately write defeat in ledgers of tonnage rather than in the charge of any cavalry. Picture the shape of it. The North African coast runs roughly east to west for more than 2,000 miles, but the useful part of it, the part where armies could actually operate and be supplied, was far narrower. From Tripoli, where the Italians had established their principal port, the coastline curves eastward in a great arc. Benghazi sits perhaps 300 miles away. Then Tobruk, another 250 miles further still. And beyond that, the coast stretches toward Egypt, toward Alexandria, across distances that seemed manageable on a map, but which in the reality of desert logistics became an ever-lengthening wire of vulnerability. Inland, just a few miles from the sea, in most places, lay the vast emptiness. The Sahara does not wait. It begins almost at the shore, and it extends southward in an unbroken expanse of rock, sand, and heat that offers nothing to an army. There are no villages to forage from, no water to be drawn from wells, no possibility of living off the land. Everything, every grain of ammunition, every liter of fuel, every drop of drinking water, had to come from somewhere else and be carried forward. This simple fact, this geographical reality, would become the true opponent. The coastal road, such as it was, wound along the shore and then inland through gaps in the terrain where passage was possible. It was not a highway in any modern sense. Much of it was simply track, hardpan, and the dried beds of seasonal watercourses. In places, it was barely distinguishable from the desert itself, and as you moved eastward from Tripoli, the road became thinner, more exposed, more prey to interruption. Every convoy that travelled it was a thread extending from the port cities, and every mile of thread was a mile farther from supplies, a mile closer to the enemy, a mile more vulnerable to being cut. The sea itself formed the other half of the geography's equation. The Mediterranean in wartime was contested water. The British held Alexandria and the Suez Canal to the east. They held Gibraltar to the west. They held Malta, that small fortified island that sits almost exactly between North Africa and Sicily, commanding the central sea lanes. This was not neutral water. Ships attempting to run supplies from Italy to North Africa would have to cross distances that brought them within range of British aircraft, British submarines, and the terrible interdiction campaign that would only intensify as the war progressed. The sea route was shorter than any alternative, but it was also increasingly dangerous, and nothing could alter that calculus. So the theatre was defined by this geometry of constraint. Tripoli and Benghazi as supply ports, distant from Italy, distant from the fighting lines that would advance eastward. The coastal road as the connecting thread, the sea lanes as another, more perilous thread, constantly under assault, and inland, pressing down from the north and ready to exploit any moment of weakness, the vastness of the desert itself, which was as much an enemy as any formation of tanks or infantry. Consider the distances as they would matter in practice. From the port of Tripoli to the town of Sirte, perhaps 200 miles, a long day's drive across difficult terrain for a convoy of trucks. From Sirte to Benghazi, another 150 miles or more. From Benghazi to Tobruk, 250 miles through increasingly sparse country. And from Tobruk toward the Egyptian border, the road became even more tenuous, more exposed, stretching across the plateau of Cyrenaica and then down toward the coastal flats, where Rommel would eventually mount his greatest efforts. These were not the distances of European warfare, where supply dumps could be established every 30 or 50 miles, and where railways might carry the burden. These were the distances of a desert campaign, where every facility had to be improvised, where breakdowns could strand men in hostile territory, where weather and terrain were as lethal as enemy fire. What made this geography particularly merciless was its asymmetry. The Allies, defending eastward from Egypt, were fighting toward their own territory. Every mile they yielded was a mile lost, but it was also a mile gained by an enemy whose supply lines stretched longer. The Germans and Italians, fighting eastward from Tripoli, were fighting away from their base. The farther they advanced, the more successful they appeared tactically, but the more they starved logistically. There was a mathematical relationship between distance and supply that no amount of German efficiency or Italian determination could overcome. It was written into the earth itself. The coastal road and the sea lanes formed two separate supply arteries, and neither one was reliable. The road could be disrupted by sandstorms, by mechanical failure, by enemy air attack, by simple distance. The sea route could be disrupted by submarines, by the Italian Navy's chronic weakness, by the increasingly effective operations of the Malta-based air squadrons. In an ideal campaign, an army would be supplied by both simultaneously, each compensating for the failures of the other. But in the Mediterranean theatre of 1941 and 1942, there was no ideal. There was only scarcity, distance, and the slow realization that no matter how many ships sailed and no matter how many trucks rolled, there would never quite be enough. The geography was not a backdrop to the campaign. It was the campaign. Every tactical decision that Rommel would make, every audacious thrust eastward, every moment when German columns raced across the desert and British commanders scrambled to respond, all of it was constrained, threatened, and ultimately doomed by this simple fact of distance and supply. The geography of the Mediterranean theatre would prove far more powerful than any general's ambition. It would write the true history of the Afrika Korps, not in the glamorous terms of desert warfare that still capture imaginations, but in the unglamorous mathematics of tonnage, distance, and the slow arithmetic of attrition that no tactical victory could reverse. What you're about to enter is a story that spans nearly 3 years, unfolds across a theatre of war, where geography itself became the true adversary, and involves thousands upon thousands of individual decisions about how to move fuel, ammunition, food, and water across one of the planet's harshest environments. It is, in many ways, a story told in logistical ledgers and harbour manifests, rather than in the thunder of tank battles, though those battles were merely the surface manifestation of something far more fundamental happening beneath. The supply war in North Africa was not decided by any single general's brilliance or any one tactical maneuver that we might recall from a history book. Instead, it was decided by the slow accumulation of small failures and large distances, by the capacity of ports to unload cargo, by the number of ships that could make the crossing without being sunk, by how much fuel could be stored in depots along a coastal road that stretched for hundreds of miles, and by the question that haunted every commander: where would the next convoy come from, and would it arrive in time? This is the kind of history that requires patience to unfold, because its significance lies not in the dramatic moment, but in the patterns that emerge when you pull back far enough to see the whole picture. You will discover, as we move through these nights ahead, that the Afrika Korps was never truly defeated in the way that popular imagination suggests. It was not overcome in a single catastrophic battle, or through the genius of a rival commander, though fine commanders certainly existed on both sides. Rather, it was worn down, starved, and ultimately abandoned by the simple mathematics of war, by the brutal arithmetic of supply and demand, when demand lives in the desert, and supply must travel across the sea. If you find yourself drawn to this particular kind of historical narrative, if you sense that understanding how wars are truly won requires looking beyond the charging cavalry and the heroic stands, if you want to follow along as we trace the invisible threads that connected a harbour in Italy to a tank crew running out of fuel in the Western Desert, then this is a story that deserves your company across multiple nights. Each evening, you can settle deeper into understanding how one of history's most dynamic military campaigns was actually decided not by generals or soldiers, but by the unglamorous work of moving supplies across impossible terrain. If this exploration interests you, consider subscribing to hear the complete unfolding of how the Afrika Korps' true battlefield was not the sand, but the supply lines that could never quite reach far enough. The narrative we're about to trace begins in early 1941, when Italy's failing campaign in Libya forced a fateful decision in Berlin. Mussolini's ambitions in North Africa had proven far too grand for Italian resources, and Hitler, faced with the prospect of losing his only ally's foothold on the African continent, made the choice to send German forces to salvage the situation. This decision, which seemed straightforward at the time, would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire Mediterranean theatre and create one of the most peculiar campaigns of the Second World War. The Afrika Korps arrived not as a massive invasion force, as many assume, but as something far more modest in initial conception. In February of 1941, the first German units landed in Tripoli, and their very small size was almost deceptive. What Rommel received was not an army capable of conquering North Africa in any conventional sense, but rather a force designed to stabilize the Italian position and perhaps push the British back if circumstances permitted. The irony, which would become clearer as the campaign progressed, was that this modest force of perhaps 20,000 men, in its earliest form, would eventually stretch supply lines so thin that the entire concept of supplying an army in the desert would be tested to its breaking point and beyond. From the very beginning, the geography of North Africa imposed constraints that no amount of German military genius could overcome. There were only two significant ports in the Western Desert that could handle meaningful cargo volumes: Tripoli in Libya, which received supplies across the Mediterranean from Italy, and Benghazi further east, which could theoretically handle additional traffic, but which sat in a position that made it extremely vulnerable to British interdiction. Between these two ports and the advancing front lines lay hundreds of miles of coastal desert, linked by a single coastal road that was sometimes barely worthy of the name. Every mile eastward that the front advanced meant that supplies had to travel farther from their source, that trucks had to burn more fuel simply to reach the fighting, that the logistical tail grew longer while the logistical head grew weaker. Consider for a moment the basic mathematics that would haunt every planning session in both Italian and German headquarters. A truck convoy traveling from Tripoli to the front, which might be anywhere from 300 to 600 miles away, depending on the precise phase of the campaign, consumed fuel simply by making the journey. A truck traveling 600 miles to deliver supplies might burn half its cargo in fuel just to get there and return. The farther the front advanced, the fewer actual supplies arrived at the destination, the more the advance consumed its own substance in the very act of advancing. It was a problem that would only become worse as the campaign intensified and as Rommel's ambitions grew. And Rommel's ambitions would indeed grow. Within weeks of arriving in North Africa, he had begun to sense an opportunity. The British forces opposing him seemed uncertain, their lines appeared thin in places, and the desert, vast and seemingly empty, offered possibilities for maneuver and encirclement that had not existed in the static trench warfare of Europe. By the spring of 1941, he had begun to push eastward, driving the British back from their positions and capturing Cyrenaica. With each advance, with each victory, with each British withdrawal, the question of supply became more urgent and more complex. What made this particular war so different from the European campaigns was the way geography itself became an active participant in the struggle. On the Eastern Front, or in France, armies could spread laterally, could feed themselves from captured supplies and conquered territory, could bypass obstacles. In the North African desert, there was nowhere to spread laterally. The sea stood to the north, impassable except at specific ports. The interior was vast, empty, and waterless. The only direction that mattered was along the coastal road, and that meant that supply lines could not be bypassed, could not be redundantly routed, could not afford to fail. There was one artery of supply, and if that artery was blocked or damaged or stretched too thin, the entire enterprise began to die. This is the story of what happens when that single artery begins to fail, when the distances grow too great, when the capacity of the ports cannot match the hunger of the front, when the sea itself becomes an enemy that claims the ships carrying supplies before they can ever reach their destination. It is a story that will reveal itself in layers across the nights ahead, showing how a campaign that began with German confidence and apparent victory was actually being decided, month by month, shipment by shipment, by forces that were quiet, unglamorous, and ultimately insurmountable. In the autumn of 1940, Benito Mussolini stood at a crossroads he had not anticipated. His Italian forces, commanded by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, had invaded Egypt from Libya in September with considerable fanfare, yet by November they had stalled entirely, their momentum dissipated by supply difficulties and the surprisingly stiff resistance of much smaller British forces under General Sir Archibald Wavell. The desert, it seemed, was teaching the Italian General Staff a lesson their propaganda ministries had glossed over. Conquest required not merely enthusiasm or numerical superiority, but the invisible infrastructure of fuel, ammunition, food, and water moving across vast, empty spaces. Graziani's advance had carried him little more than 60 miles into Egyptian territory before stopping dead, as if the desert itself had become an impassable barrier, not of sand, but of logistics. Back in Rome, Mussolini's grand vision of imperial expansion in North Africa was beginning to crack under the weight of reality. The British, despite being dramatically outnumbered, held their ground and waited, and then, in a move that surprised the Axis leadership, they attacked. Operation Compass, launched on December 9, 1940, saw Wavell's compact, meticulously organized force strike at Graziani's extended and thinly held positions. Within weeks, the entire Italian position in Libya was collapsing. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were captured. The confidence that had filled Italian headquarters seemed to evaporate as quickly as water in the desert sun. Graziani's army retreated westward in disarray, and by February 1941, the Italians found themselves clinging to a few coastal cities, their grand North African campaign in ruins. This moment of crisis presented the German High Command with a choice. Adolf Hitler had initially viewed North Africa as a peripheral theatre, a sideshow to his main preoccupation with the Soviet Union. Yet he understood that allowing his Italian ally to be driven entirely out of North Africa would damage the Axis cause and embolden the British. More pragmatically, if the British secured Libya and could establish themselves firmly in North Africa, the Mediterranean would become a British lake, and the Reich's southern flank would be exposed to threats far more serious than seemed possible at the time. A decision was made in Berlin. Germany would dispatch a task force to Libya to stabilize the Axis position and prevent further Italian collapse. This decision, made in the winter of 1940 and 1941, would reshape the entire North African campaign, and in ways neither Hitler nor Mussolini could have foreseen, would become a test case in a kind of warfare that would consume far more resources and attention than any of the high commanders had imagined. It was not to be a massive investment. Hitler had no intention of pouring vast armies into North Africa when the real struggle would be in Russia, but a relatively small, mobile, highly trained force that could restore equilibrium and demonstrate German military superiority. For this task, Hitler selected an officer who was beginning to develop a reputation as something between a tactical visionary and an ambitious opportunist, General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel. In early February 1941, Rommel arrived in North Africa with the first elements of what would become known as the Deutsches Afrika Korps, or the Afrika Korps. He was 49 years old, a career officer with an excellent record in the First World War and considerable experience in mechanized warfare. He had written books on infantry tactics. He had observed the French campaign with a keen eye for how mobile forces could exploit openings in an enemy's line, and he possessed, in abundance, the kind of aggressive temperament that appealed to Hitler's own sense of warfare: audacious, opportunistic, willing to take risks for decisive results. What Rommel did not yet fully understand, though he would learn it through the long and bitter years that followed, was that North Africa would teach him a different sort of lesson than the one his tactical innovations promised. Here, far from the industrial heartland of Germany, in a desert where every bullet and every gallon of fuel had to cross thousands of miles of sea and land to reach him, the rules would be different. Victory would not belong to the cleverest tactician or the most audacious commander, but to the general who could most efficiently manage the pitiless arithmetic of supply and distance. The first German units to arrive in North Africa were small, only about 5,000 troops initially, with light armoured vehicles and reconnaissance elements. But they possessed something that the Italian forces lacked: training, equipment, and the reputation of German military excellence. More important still, Rommel was given instructions to stabilize the situation, but also, crucially, to gather intelligence about what might be possible. As he surveyed the landscape before him, the coastline where Tripoli and Benghazi served as distant ports, the vast inland desert, and the thin line of the coastal road that stretched eastward toward Egypt, Rommel's mind began to work in calculations of possibility. What would happen, he wondered, in those early weeks, if German mobile forces could be unleashed across this open terrain? The British were formidable, certainly, but they seemed thinly scattered. If a sufficiently aggressive commander could concentrate forces and move quickly, might he not strike them a blow that would reverse the entire strategic situation? It was a tantalizing thought, and it would shape everything that followed. But lurking beneath this tactical optimism was a reality that Rommel sensed but could not yet fully articulate. The desert itself was the true opponent, and it would wage its war not through gunfire, but through the silent consumption of everything that an army required to survive. The decision to send Rommel to North Africa was, in retrospect, both a brilliant choice and a fateful one. It would inject German energy and competence into a faltering campaign. It would produce, for a time, dramatic victories that would make Rommel's name famous across the world. But it would also, over the course of nearly 3 years, place a general of considerable ability in a situation where his talents for maneuver and aggression would be constantly frustrated by the pitiless mathematics of supply. He was arriving in North Africa not knowing that he would spend nearly 1,000 days fighting an enemy that could not be defeated by courage or innovation, but only by the slow, grinding accumulation of resources. That battle, invisible to those who watched the desert campaigns from a distance, was already beginning to take shape, even as Rommel surveyed his new command for the first time. When Erwin Rommel arrived at Tripoli in February of 1941, he did not come with an army. He came with a promise and a problem. The promise was German intervention to save Italy's failing campaign in North Africa. The problem was that he had been given remarkably little with which to keep that promise. The Deutsche Afrika Korps, as it would come to be known, began not as a grand invasion force, but as something far more modest, a single reinforced division, perhaps 15,000 men in those earliest weeks. equipped with tanks that were functional rather than revolutionary, and a handful of support units that seemed almost apologetic in their modesty. It was the sort of force that Berlin believed could steady the line, perhaps even probe eastward toward Egypt, while remaining small enough not to stretch German resources at a moment when the Wehrmacht was still absorbing the vast conquest of France and beginning to contemplate something far grander still in Eastern Europe. Rommel himself was a man of tremendous energy, a general whose reputation had been forged not in the grand strategic theatres, but in small unit tactics and relentless pursuit. He had commanded with distinction in France, and Hitler had noticed. But there is something quietly revealing about the way Rommel was sent to North Africa, with such modest means and such expansive expectations. It speaks to a fundamental disconnect that would echo through every month of the campaign to come, a vision of what might be achieved that was never quite matched to the means of achieving it. One might wonder, as you settle deeper into this narrative, whether this mismatch was itself inevitable, or whether it arose from the particular way that military ambition and logistical reality so often fail to speak the same language. The Afrika Korps that took shape over those first weeks was, by the standards of the great armies massing in Europe, almost a sideshow, yet it would become something unforgettable, not because it conquered, but because it represented a kind of military tragedy in miniature, the story of brilliant tactical improvisation being slowly crushed beneath the weight of an impossible supply line. Rommel had perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 troops initially, a modest armoured component, some artillery, and the eternal optimism of a field commander who believed that aggressive action and clever manoeuvre could accomplish what material resources could not. He had seen it work in France, where rapid movement and psychological pressure had shattered French and British defences. Why should the desert be any different? But the desert, as it would turn out, was very different indeed. It was not merely a larger France. It was something that operated according to its own arithmetic, its own iron laws that cared nothing for tactical brilliance or the force of personality. The desert demanded supplies, water, fuel, ammunition, food, in quantities that seemed to grow with every mile of advance, and it demanded them across distances that made every convoy a gamble and every supply depot a potential point of catastrophic failure. When Rommel looked at a map and saw the great empty spaces between Tripoli and Egypt, he likely saw opportunity. What he was only beginning to understand was that he was looking at a vast and patient enemy, distance itself. In these opening months, as the Afrika Korps began to organize itself in the barren landscape around Tripoli, the true nature of the North African campaign was already taking shape, though few seemed to grasp it clearly. The commanders talked, naturally, about tactics and maneuver. They considered lines of advance and points of resistance. They studied the terrain with the eyes of men trained to think in military terms. But beneath all of this, beneath the conference tables and the operation orders and the reconnaissance reports, there was running a parallel war, a war conducted in harbours and on merchant ships, in warehouses and supply depots, in the calculations of quartermaster officers and the desperate calculations of Italian convoy captains, trying to cross the Mediterranean while British submarines and RAF aircraft hunted them from Malta. This quieter war would ultimately prove far more consequential than the one fought between tanks and artillery. Yet it was the kind of war that rarely attracts the attention or the romantic interest that tank battles do. There were no heroic charges in the supply war, no dramatic moments of breakthrough and encirclement. There was only the steady, relentless mathematics of how much tonnage could be delivered, how much fuel could be moved forward, how long a supply line could be stretched before it snapped. And from the very beginning, from those first weeks when Rommel was still new to the theatre and still convinced that aggressive action could overcome any obstacle, the numbers were working against him. Consider the simple fact of geography. Tripoli, where the Afrika Korps was based, where the ships arrived with supplies from Sicily and Italy, was nearly 800 miles from the Egyptian frontier. That was the distance that supplies had to travel, moving across a desert that offered almost no shelter, where a truck that broke down did not simply wait for repair, but sat baking in the sun, its engine slowly cooking, its tires deteriorating, its cargo slowly becoming worthless. A truck that left Tripoli with fuel could not reach the front and return. That meant fuel depots had to be established and maintained along the way, and fuel depots meant more supplies had to be sent to stock them. More trucks had to travel to establish them, and the system fed upon itself in a way that seemed to grow hungrier the farther the front line advanced. The officers around Rommel, the younger ones especially, seemed to share their commander's confidence that movement and aggression could overcome these difficulties. The early battles would vindicate this confidence. The Italians had been faltering, but with German reinforcement and Rommel's energetic leadership, the Axis forces would achieve remarkable tactical successes in the spring of 1941. Yet even as these victories were being achieved, the supply officers were filing reports that told a different story. Reports about the difficulty of maintaining adequate fuel stocks, about the strain on the Italian convoys crossing the Mediterranean, about the small but growing problem of getting enough supplies to the front line to sustain even the current level of operations, let alone any significant advance. This, then, was the paradox that would define the entire Afrika Korps saga. A force that was numerically small would attempt to achieve results that seemed to require a force far larger. Tactics would achieve in the spring what logistics insisted could not be sustained through the summer. And all the while, the real battlefield was taking shape, not in the sand and rock of the western desert, but in the shipping lanes of the Mediterranean, in the harbours of Tripoli and Benghazi, in the quartermasters' tents where men with pencils and ledgers were fighting a war that would ultimately prove to be the true deciding factor in the North African campaign. One might reflect, as we move deeper into this long narrative, on how often it is that the wars that decide history are not the ones that are celebrated in dramatic accounts, but rather the wars conducted in silence, in logistics and supply, in the grinding mathematics of sustenance and survival. The harbour at Tripoli, on a morning in early 1941, would have presented itself as both a blessing and a curse to the officers of the newly arrived Afrika Korps. Ships lay at anchor, their hulls casting long shadows across water that reflected the pale gold of North African dawn, and dock workers moved with the careful exhaustion of men who understood that every crate unloaded was a small victory against geography itself. Tripoli was the closest thing the Axis forces had to a reliable gateway, a natural harbour that the Italians had invested in over decades of colonial presence. Yet it was constrained in ways that would come to define the entire campaign. The port could handle, at its absolute maximum capacity, when conditions aligned and circumstances favoured the operators, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 tons of cargo per day. To the modern ear, accustomed to the container ships and mechanised terminals of contemporary ports, this figure might sound almost quaint, almost manageable. But consider the appetite it was meant to feed. A single panzer division required roughly 300 tons of supplies daily when actively engaged in operations, and that calculation assumes a relatively static campaign without the constant movement eastward that Rommel envisioned and demanded. The mathematics began to assert themselves quietly at first. Tripoli received shipments from Italian ports across the Mediterranean, principally from Naples and Messina, voyages that consumed 5 to 7 days depending on the route and the weather. These convoys did not move with the frequency that the desert commander might have wished, constrained as they were by vessel availability, the competing demands of other theatres, and increasingly, as the months wore on, the presence of British submarines and aircraft operating from Malta and other bases. So Tripoli became a throat through which an entire army had to drink, and the capacity of that throat, fixed by geography and by the equipment available, could never quite expand to match demand. When a ship arrived after its journey from Italy, it faced another bottleneck. The port had only a limited number of cranes and unloading facilities. Equipment was sometimes damaged, supplies were sometimes improperly stowed, and workers moved at the pace that heat, exhaustion, and the constant threat of air raids permitted. The rhythm of unloading was therefore not one of haste, but of steady, methodical labor, hour after hour, day after day, the human body and mechanical leverage working against the vast distance that lay inland. And it was this distance that constituted the true adversary. From Tripoli, the supply line ran eastward along a single coastal road, a ribbon of asphalt and compacted earth that stretched toward Benghazi, 350 miles away. Every ton of supplies that arrived at Tripoli's docks had to traverse this distance, loaded onto trucks that themselves consumed fuel and required maintenance. And the further that supply line extended, the more of its own cargo it consumed in the mere act of delivery. A truck that left Tripoli with 50 tons of supplies would arrive at a forward depot 200 miles away, having burned through fuel to transport itself and its cargo. The fuel that truck consumed was itself part of the supply calculation. It was subtracted from the quantities available to the fighting units. This created a kind of mathematics that seemed to mock itself, an equation in which the attempt to solve it altered the terms of the problem. Consider the rhythm of this system as it might have appeared on a map spread across a commander's desk. Supplies pool at Tripoli, trucks queue to be loaded, sometimes for hours or even days depending on the backlog. They depart eastward, their engines straining against the heat and the sand. They arrive at Benghazi, roughly halfway along the route to the forward areas, where another port facility existed, smaller and less reliable than Tripoli, but crucial nonetheless as a secondary distribution point. Benghazi was a city built on the coast of Cyrenaica, with its own harbour, its own docks, and its own acute limitations. It was indeed less congested than Tripoli, and supplies could be received there and distributed onward more quickly. But Benghazi, like Tripoli, depended entirely on sea-based resupply, and its harbour was smaller, more exposed to weather and to enemy action. Moreover, the political and logistical logic of the campaign meant that supplies continuing eastward from Benghazi had to travel another 400 or more miles to reach the forward areas where Rommel's units operated in spring and early summer of 1941. That was the crux of it. The distance kept growing, and with each passing week and each eastward advance, the supply line became longer, thinner, more vulnerable to disruption. A division operating 300 miles from Tripoli required supplies to travel that distance and then travel back empty, or travel back laden with wounded and damaged equipment. The trucks themselves, aging Fiat models, and captured French vehicles that the Germans pressed into service, began to fail more frequently. Tires wore through on the rough roads, engines seized in the heat. Spare parts had to be transported from Europe, adding to the very supply burden they were meant to address. Why did Rommel, then, not simply consolidate his supply lines and accept a slower pace of advance? The answer lies in the seductive nature of early success and in the particular character of the man leading the campaign. But to understand the trap that distance was laying, it helps to imagine the perspective of a supply officer at Tripoli in April of 1941. Ships are arriving less frequently than needed. The docks are perpetually congested. News comes that Rommel has advanced another 50 miles eastward, and another 50 miles beyond that, and that his units are requesting additional supplies at even greater intensity than before. The supply officer knows that trucks must now travel further, consume more fuel, and return slower. He knows that his reserves at Benghazi, which should cushion against shipment delays, are dwindling because the forward units are drawing from them faster than they can be replenished. He feels the geometry of the problem asserting itself, the way distance and demand are creating an equation with no pleasant solution. The port capacity cannot be increased without building new facilities, which would require time and materials and labor that the Axis simply did not possess in North Africa. The truck fleet cannot expand without shipments of new vehicles, which must also make the journey across the Mediterranean, which must also be unloaded at Tripoli or Benghazi, adding to the very congestion it was meant to relieve. And so the system developed a kind of internal contradiction, a slowly tightening constraint that would ultimately limit every strategic choice available to the Axis command. The British, watching from Egypt and from signals intelligence stations, began to perceive this weakness, though perhaps not yet with full clarity. But they could read the supply situation in the movements of German units, in the patterns of their advances and their pauses. Rommel would push forward rapidly when supplies were flush, then halt and consolidate when they ran thin. The rhythm was almost predictable, written in fuel and food and ammunition, in the dry mathematics of logistics. By understanding Tripoli and Benghazi as the twin capillaries through which blood had to flow to feed this distant campaign, one begins to understand that the Afrika Korps was never truly free to execute the grand strategy that Rommel imagined. It was constrained, always, by the question of what could be delivered, at what rate, over what distance. And as the months passed, as the distance increased, as the system grew more complex and more fragile, this constraint became the quiet protagonist of the story, the unseen force that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire campaign, not through dramatic action, but through the steady accumulation of shortfalls, delays, and exhausted resources. But the distance from Tripoli to the forward airfields and supply dumps was only half the story. Before a single truck could rumble eastward across the Libyan coast, the cargo had to make a crossing that was, in many ways, far more dangerous than any engagement in the sand. The Mediterranean itself became a battlefield, though one that most histories of the Desert War mention only in passing, as if the sea were merely a backdrop. Yet for every gallon of fuel that reached Africa, another gallon never arrived at all. Ships sank in the depths, submarines waited in the dark, and high above the convoys, aircraft from a small island fortress watched and calculated and struck. The route from Italy to Libya was not a short one. From Naples or Taranto, the supply ships had to travel south and east, skirting the Italian mainland, crossing open water toward Sicily, or sometimes running directly toward the African coast. The journey could take 3 days, 4 days, even longer, depending on the wind and the tide and the vigilance of unseen enemies. For commanders accustomed to thinking in terms of miles on land, this was an almost incomprehensible delay. A truck could theoretically cover the distance in hours. A ship, laden with trucks and fuel drums and ammunition, crept across the surface of the sea at perhaps 12 knots, vulnerable to every form of attack from below and above. The Italians, who had operated in these waters for centuries, knew the risks better than anyone. Yet they were asked to send convoy after convoy, loaded with supplies for an army that was never satisfied. The British understood the mathematics of this crossing even more intimately than the Germans did. They had Malta. The island sits almost directly in the path between Sicily and North Africa, a rocky fortress of perhaps 170 square miles, populated by fewer than 250,000 souls who would endure years of bombardment for this single strategic fact. Malta was close enough to the convoys to matter, close enough that submarines based there could hunt at night, close enough that aircraft, during the brief windows when fuel and pilots were available, could strike at merchantmen as they passed within 100 miles of the island's shores. The British commitment to holding Malta despite the constant German and Italian air attacks that would rain down upon it, was not a matter of sentiment or honor. It was pure logistics. Malta was the dagger pointed at the heart of the supply lines. The Italian Navy had other concerns, of course. They were never quite confident enough, or perhaps never quite brave enough, to take on the British Mediterranean fleet in the kind of decisive engagement that both sides occasionally imagined. There were moments of local superiority, brief windows when Italian battleships and cruisers ranged freely, but these never lasted long. The British, fighting from the eastern Mediterranean, from Alexandria and Port Said, maintained a presence that was invisible but never absent, and their submarines, British and sometimes Polish boats, hunted in the waters between Italy and Africa with a grim persistence that the Italian Navy could never quite eliminate. The mathematics of convoy loss is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shaped the entire campaign in ways that casualty reports from Tobruk or Gazala could never quite capture. In the early months, perhaps 1 ship in 20 was lost to enemy action or accident. That sounds like a percentage that an army might absorb, but it meant that if an Italian shipowner's business plan called for carrying 500 tons of supplies to Libya, the army expecting that cargo would receive only 475 tons. If the next convoy lost slightly more to bad weather, or a particularly active British submarine pack, the shortfall grew. Month after month, the small attrition compounds. It is like watching a great machine slowly lose its power to move forward. The loss so gradual that commanders on land, reviewing their losses and their victories, might not at first understand what was truly happening. The British submarines were masterpieces of patient hunting. They waited in the narrows between Sicily and Malta. They loitered off the Libyan coast. They communicated with Malta by radio, and pilots of the RAF, when fuel and circumstances allowed, would scramble to intercept convoys that had been reported by submerged scouts. Some of the most successful submarine commanders of the Mediterranean War became something like celebrities in Malta, their names known to the civilian population who huddled in shelters during the endless air raids. These men, often officers who had trained in peacetime navies that moved at a leisurely pace, became killers of merchant ships and soldiers they would never see. The Italian convoys were sometimes protected by destroyers, occasionally by older cruisers. Naval escorts were a precious resource, and they could not be everywhere at once. The calculus became a kind of terrible poetry. How many warships could be spared from other duties to guard a convoy? What was the real value of a ship carrying spare parts versus one carrying fuel? Could smaller, faster convoys evade detection better than large, slow ones? Each choice carried hidden consequences that would not be fully understood until months later, when a shortage of anti-aircraft ammunition, or replacement engines, or spare parts for transmissions suddenly made itself felt in the desert. One might wonder, in the quiet hours before sleep comes, what those Italian sailors thought as they crossed the Mediterranean. They were not soldiers, not bound by the strict hierarchy of military life in the way that the crews of warships were. They were often conscripts, sometimes volunteers, but mostly ordinary men who had been conscripted into service in the merchant marine and told to move cargo across a sea that had become actively hostile. They could not see the submarines that might be tracking them. They could not always identify an incoming aircraft before it attacked. They lived in the terror of the unexpected, the instantaneous, the final. Hundreds of them died in the cold waters, their names recorded in Italian maritime records that few people read anymore, their deaths contributing to the slow suffocation of an entire campaign thousands of miles away. The tonnage that actually arrived in Libya was always less than what had been sent from Italy. The percentage loss varied month by month, season by season, depending on British activity from Malta and the deployment of submarines. In some months, the loss rate climbed to nearly 40%. In others, when German air power was strong and British resources thin, perhaps only 5 or 10% of the cargo never arrived. But those percentages were cumulative over time. They were not discrete failures that could be studied and fixed, but rather a chronic condition that slowly bled the North African campaign of its ability to sustain offensive operations. The Quiet War beneath the Desert War, as historians sometimes call it, was perhaps the most decisive conflict of the entire campaign. It was not fought with the great sweep of tactics that military schools love to study. It involved no dramatic charges, no desperate hand-to-hand fighting, no moments of individual heroism that journalists could easily report. It was fought in the depths of the Mediterranean, in the hangars of Malta where aircraft were maintained by exhausted ground crews, in the offices of Italian shipowners who stared at ledgers showing declining profits and lost vessels, and in the careful analysis rooms where British intelligence officers decoded enemy communications and worked to predict where convoys might be found. The Germans, for all their tactical genius, never quite managed to solve this problem. Rommel would later insist, with considerable accuracy, that his campaign was lost not in the sand, but on the sea, in the waters between Italy and Africa. He was right, though even he did not fully appreciate how early and how fundamentally the mathematics of that crossing had determined the outcome. The convoys crossing the Mediterranean in 1941, carrying supplies for an army that seemed to be achieving impossible victories, were already bringing less than what was needed to sustain those victories into the future. The shortfall was not obvious. It accumulated slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river, invisible until one day the entire river's character had changed. Yet beneath all the maps and the grand strategic calculations, there existed a quieter, more relentless enemy, one that required no ammunition, no fuel of its own, and asked nothing of the mind that conceived battle plans. It was the desert itself, working in collaboration with heat and sand and time, dismantling vehicles and reducing men, not through explosive force, but through the patient, grinding attrition of simple physics and material fatigue. The trucks that carried supplies across North Africa were never truly designed for what they were asked to endure. The German army relied heavily on captured French vehicles, Czech trucks, and Italian transports, a patchwork fleet of necessity rather than choice. When you drove these machines across the Libyan plateau in summer, temperatures inside the cab could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, a threshold beyond which human endurance begins to fail, but also beyond which metal and rubber and leather begin a slow dissolution that no maintenance schedule could arrest. The engines, designed to run in temperate European climates, found their cooling systems struggling before dawn had fully broken. Radiators, already prone to mineral deposits from the brackish Mediterranean water used to fill them, would crystallize further under the relentless sun, causing temperatures to spike and gaskets to weep. What happened next was almost inevitable. An engine running too hot will thin its oil beyond the point where it can provide adequate lubrication. Bearings that had tolerated thousands of kilometers of European roads would begin to seize within weeks of desert service. Drivers would notice a roughness in the engine's voice, a grinding quality that spoke of metal touching metal where there should have been only the whisper of oil between them. Push harder, and the bearing would fail entirely. The truck would coast to a stop, and unless a replacement engine or bearing assembly could be brought forward, which, in the context of a stretched supply chain, was itself a luxury, the vehicle became a stationary hulk, a chassis absorbing heat and slowly rusting into the sand. But the engine was only part of the story. The transmission, the clutch plates, the bearings in the wheels themselves, each component experienced its own drama of thermal expansion and mechanical fatigue. The sand, that omnipresent abrasive, found its way into every seal, every bearing race, every crevice where two surfaces met. It was not dramatic sabotage. It was more like a slow polishing of internal surfaces, a gradual reduction in tolerances, until the machine simply would not move with its former smoothness. Filters clogged, despite being cleaned daily. Spark plugs would foul. Carburetors, starved of clean air, would develop poor fuel atomization and stalling. Consider the tire, that humble ring of rubber and cloth that carried tons of weight across unyielding terrain. A tire designed for European roads might last 20,000 kilometers. In the North African desert, the same tire might fail in 2,000. The heat would cause the rubber compound to harden and lose its grip. The rocks and the hardened carapace of old dried mud would puncture the sidewalls or shred the tread. The maintenance records from German and Italian units tell a story of perpetual tire shortages. Trucks laid up not because of enemy action, but because they had no wheels that could safely carry a load. Spare tires were precious cargo. A damaged tire could not always be repaired, because the compounds and vulcanizing equipment needed to patch it were themselves perishable under heat and scarce in a theater where supply ships were being sunk by submarine and aircraft. And then there was the question of water, that paradoxical abundance and scarcity. The Mediterranean lay near, shimmering, unreachable. The water carried in trucks for human consumption and for refilling radiators was carefully rationed, and not because supplies were always desperately low, but because transporting water in bulk was profoundly inefficient. A truck carrying water could not carry fuel or ammunition. It took gasoline to transport water, and to transport the gasoline that transported the water. The arithmetic became almost comical. To deliver 1,000 liters of water to troops 60 kilometers from the nearest source might require consuming 2,000 liters of gasoline in the trucks doing the hauling. Water rations in the desert, therefore, were never generous. Radiators made do with less, and when that happened, engines ran hotter. The cycle worsened in a slow spiral. One might imagine that desert conditions were at least predictable, even if harsh. But the desert produced its own weather catastrophes. Dust storms would reduce visibility to mere meters, and trucks would halt, engines left running to maintain air pressure in tire casings, fuel consumed while the vehicle remained stationary. When the wind subsided, the dust covered everything. Air filters thick with accumulation, gun breeches fouled, optics scratched and blurred. Soldiers would spend hours cleaning equipment that would be recontaminated before evening, and the maintenance burden of keeping even a small fleet operational was staggering. A panzer division, for instance, traveling across the desert, might have a support echelon of 500 to 1,000 trucks. In a temperate European theater, you might expect to maintain 80 to 85% of that fleet in running condition on any given day. The remainder would be undergoing repairs, engine work, transmission service, suspension maintenance. In North Africa, that percentage could drop to 60, sometimes 55%. Nearly half the vehicles in the rear were broken down, being repaired, or waiting for parts that were still 300 kilometers away in a shipping depot in Tripoli. What this meant, in practical terms, was that to move a division forward, you needed to deploy supply trucks that themselves became casualties not to enemy fire, but to entropy. A truck sent from Tripoli with fuel might be consumed by the journey itself, leaving the frontline troops with barely more supply than if the truck had never been sent at all. The longer the line of communication, the higher the proportion of supply that was devoured by the machinery of supply itself. It is a gentle truth, but a haunting one. The desert was an adversary that Rommel's forces could never fully comprehend or overcome through tactical genius or aggressive spirit. The sand did not respect boldness. The heat did not understand the word strategy. Machines would fail, not at the moment of greatest need, but simply because they had been pushed beyond the tolerances that their designers, sitting in comfortable German factories, had never imagined they would face. And this slow, mechanical attrition would become, in the end, more consequential than any single battle, more defining than any general's reputation. The desert would win, not through courage or cunning, but through patience and the simple, inevitable laws of physics working upon metal and rubber and the fragile human beings who depended on them. When Erwin Rommel arrived at Tripoli in February of 1941, he stepped into a theatre of war that seemed, to a certain kind of military mind, almost tailor-made for swift maneuver and decisive action. The desert stretched before him in vast, open monotony. There were few natural obstacles, no dense forests to bog down armor, no networks of trenches waiting to be assaulted. To a commander trained in the fluid tactics of armored warfare, this landscape appeared to promise something intoxicating. The possibility of rapid movement, of outflanking an enemy, of winning through speed and audacity rather than grinding attrition. And in those first weeks of spring 1941, it seemed almost as though the desert itself had been designed to validate that vision. Rommel's Afrika Korps began as a modest force, numbering perhaps only a few thousand men at its inception, a reconnaissance and support unit, theoretically meant to shore up the Italian position without committing vast German resources to what some in Berlin still viewed as a peripheral theatre. But Rommel harboured no such modest ambitions. He saw an opportunity. The British forces in North Africa, commanded by General Archibald Wavell, had been stretched thin by the demands of defending Greece and other priorities across the Mediterranean. They were spread across enormous distances. A concentrated German strike, Rommel reasoned, might pierce through their lines before they could consolidate a defence. And so he moved. In early April of 1941, with elements scarcely ready for deployment, Rommel launched an offensive toward the east. It was, by the standards of desert warfare at that moment, almost reckless in its speed. Small German motorized columns, supported by Italian units, drove rapidly across the open ground. They swept past British positions. They pursued and scattered retreating formations. Within weeks, the entire British position in Cyrenaica, the eastern region of Libya, seemed to be collapsing, except for the fortress port of Tobruk, which held out with stubborn defiance. Rommel's forces were racing eastward, approaching the Egyptian frontier, threatening the whole of the British position in North Africa. Here was the seduction of momentum. For any commander, for any army, there exists a particular psychological intoxication that comes with rapid success, with the sensation of an enemy fleeing before you, with the sight of ground gained and objectives falling into your lap, almost without resistance. The mind begins to believe in its own velocity. Each day of advance seems to confirm the brilliance of the strategy, the superiority of the force, the inevitability of further victories. The normal calculations of military logistics, the careful accounting of fuel stocks, ammunition consumption, replacement parts, medical supplies, these begin to seem almost secondary to the momentum itself. Surely, the thinking goes, if we can just maintain this pace, if we can keep moving, if we can reach one more objective before the enemy can reorganize, everything will fall into place. Rommel was neither ignorant nor indifferent to supply. He was a careful student of military history, and he understood the elementary principle that armies move on their stomachs. But in the spring of 1941, as his forces rolled eastward, something fundamental was occurring beneath the surface of tactical success. With each mile that his columns advanced, each new position established further from the ports of Tripoli and Benghazi, the supply lines stretching behind them grew longer, thinner, more vulnerable. The mathematics of distance worked against him, though in those victorious weeks it was easy to ignore the arithmetic. Consider the simple geometry of supply across a desert. Tripoli lay on the western coast of Libya, a port capable of receiving ships carrying fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, food, water. When Rommel's forces were concentrated near Tripoli, a truck could make the journey to the front line and back again in a reasonable span of time. But as the front moved eastward, 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles, that simple calculation transformed. A supply truck that might once have made 2 or 3 round trips in a week found itself spending half its cargo simply fueling itself for the journey itself. The porters and drivers and mechanics who maintained these lifelines found themselves racing back and forth across expanding desert distances. This is a paradox that every advancing army eventually discovers, though Rommel was only beginning to sense its contours. The faster you advance, the harder it becomes to sustain that advance. Momentum, in the end, is a trap disguised as an opportunity. But in April and May of 1941, as German motor columns raced eastward and British forces fell back toward Egypt, this paradox remained hidden beneath a veneer of tactical brilliance. Reports came back to Berlin and Rome of extraordinary successes. German propaganda heralded the desert warrior, the daring commander, the new Hannibal striking across North Africa. Rommel's reputation, still emerging at that moment, began to take on a mythic quality even as he was still alive and fighting. He became a symbol of German military prowess, a counterpoint to the grinding, desperate struggle unfolding in Russia. What was less visible? What was nearly invisible to the journalists and war correspondents and strategic planners in distant capitals was the quiet crisis unfolding behind the lines. In the supply depots of Benghazi, Italian and German personnel were working desperately to increase unloading rates, to organize convoys, to squeeze more fuel and ammunition from a logistics pipeline that was never quite adequate. The trucks themselves, Italian trucks primarily, but also German vehicles, were beginning to wear under the stress of constant movement across sand and rock. Engines overheated, suspensions broke, tires were shredded by the desert floor. Parts that should have lasted weeks were wearing out in days. Drivers grew exhausted. Mechanical breakdowns multiplied. For every vehicle lost to enemy action, perhaps 2 were being lost to the desert itself, to heat, to sand, to the grinding entropy of machines stressed beyond their design tolerances. And yet the victories continued. Rommel's tactical skill was genuine. His troops displayed courage and adaptation. With the forces he had, still numerically smaller than the British forces facing him, he maneuvered with such ingenuity that the British formations, often larger in numbers, seemed almost sluggish by comparison. By June of 1941, Rommel's forces had established themselves on the frontier of Egypt itself. He had pushed the British out of Libya almost entirely. Tobruk alone remained, a holdout, a thorn, but seemingly soon to fall. From the perspective of Berlin and Rome, from the perspective of armchair strategists, from the perspective even of Rommel himself in moments of tactical triumph, the arithmetic of the campaign seemed almost resolved. One more push, one more victory, one more advance would break through the British defences and potentially transform the strategic map of the Mediterranean altogether. The supply situation was difficult, certainly. Commanders everywhere knew this. But the pace of advance suggested that such difficulties might be overcome by velocity itself, by refusing to stop, by maintaining momentum until the enemy fractured entirely. What was harder to see, in the spring of 1941, was that the real battle was never going to be decided on the open desert by maneuver and firepower. The battle was already being decided in the ports and supply depots, in the calculations of logistics officers working with pencils and paper, in the capacity of distant harbours to unload ships, in the availability of fuel and ammunition in increasingly distant warehouses. The seduction of momentum had masked a fundamental truth, that this war, like all wars, was ultimately a war of attrition, of resources, of the capacity to sustain yourself while denying your enemy the same capacity. And on that measure, as spring turned towards summer in North Africa, the Axis position was deteriorating even as Rommel's tactical victories mounted. The desert had not yet spoken its final verdict, but the forces that would decide the campaign were already in motion, quiet and invisible, moving through shipping routes across the Mediterranean, flowing through convoys across the sand, converting themselves slowly into the currency that would ultimately matter more than all the tactical brilliance in the world. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and the grim arithmetic of supply lines stretched too thin, growing thinner with each mile that momentum carried the Afrika Korps eastward into the vast emptiness before them. By the late spring of 1941, Rommel stood at a threshold he had not truly anticipated, though perhaps he should have seen it forming in the distance like heat shimmer across a salt flat. The Afrika Korps had moved with remarkable speed from its beachhead at Tripoli, pressing eastward along the coastal road, and in doing so had created something far more dangerous than a stalled defense. They had created a problem. That problem had a name, and it sat like a stone in the path of everything that was to follow: Tobruk. The fortress port of Tobruk lay perhaps 300 miles east of Tripoli, a natural harbour ringed by escarpments and defences that the Italians had begun to build long before Germany entered the North African theatre. When Rommel's forces reached it in April 1941, they encountered something unexpected. The British had recently captured it from Italian hands, and they had immediately understood its value. They had decided not to abandon it. They had decided to hold it, no matter the cost. And in that decision lay the seed of everything that would follow in the Desert War. From a strategic perspective, Tobruk should have been a simple problem. A general advances, a fortress sits in his way, and the general either takes the fortress or leaves a garrison to contain it and pushes on. Rommel attempted both. He threw divisions at Tobruk's perimeter in repeated attacks through the spring and into the summer. The defenders, mostly Australian troops at first, and later South African and British soldiers, held the line with a tenacity that seemed to surprise even themselves. Night after night, the assaults came. Night after night, they were repulsed. The casualty lists grew. The supply requirements to maintain the siege grew with them. And here is where the invisible mathematics of the Desert War began to write themselves in a language Rommel could not ignore. Every soldier pinned down around Tobruk's perimeter required water, ammunition, food, and medical care. Every tank that sat idle in the siege lines consumed fuel. Every attempted assault required reserves that were being drawn not from some infinite well of German production, but from convoy ships crossing the Mediterranean, from harbour cranes in Tripoli working through the heat of the afternoon, from truck drivers navigating the coastal road in convoys that grew longer and more vulnerable with each passing day. The mathematics were unforgiving. To maintain 100,000 men in a siege, you do not simply need 100,000 rations. You need transport to move those rations. You need medical supplies to treat the wounded from failed assaults. You need replacement ammunition for every gun that fires. You need spare parts for every vehicle that breaks down under the strain of desert heat and constant operation. And Tobruk was not the only fortress that needed supplies. Rommel's main forces were pushing deeper into the desert, lengthening their own tail as they advanced toward the British lines further east. The question that no one had quite answered before committing fully to this campaign was simple, though its implications were vast. How thin can a supply line stretch before it snaps? The answer, it seemed, was being written in real time in the vessels that lay at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Italian supply convoys, the lifeline of the entire Axis effort in North Africa, were coming under increasing attack from British submarines and aircraft operating from Malta and Egypt. Not every convoy was sunk. Not every ship was lost, but enough were lost, enough tonnage was sent to the ocean floor, that the equations began to fail. If Tripoli could unload 3,000 tons per day, but only 2,000 tons per day arrived due to sinkings in transit, then each day represented a deficit of 1,000 tons, and deficits, once they begin, tend to compound. Tobruk, in this slow calculus, represented something almost paradoxical. It was both a fortress that must be taken and a fortress that must never be fully invested in. Every day that Rommel's forces remained committed to its siege was a day in which they were not advancing, not securing territory, not positioning themselves for the decisive battles that might still lie ahead. And yet, leaving it in British hands meant leaving it as a thorn in the supply line itself. British ships could potentially use Tobruk as a port of supply for their own forces. British submarines could operate from Tobruk as a base. The fortress could not be ignored. And so it had to be contained, but it could not be taken, and in that contradiction lay the seeds of eventual failure. What happened over the following months was a slow, grinding process of attrition that no tactical cleverness could overcome. The British, unlike Rommel, had a supply line that stretched behind them across the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal to bases in Egypt and Palestine. They could be reinforced. They could be resupplied. Rommel could not match this. He could sustain his forces around Tobruk for a time, but the cost in resources, in fuel that should have gone to the advance, in ammunition that should have been held in reserve, was becoming prohibitive. Consider the individual soldier in the trenches around Tobruk during those long, hot months. He sat in an escarpment overlooking the harbour, his rifle propped beside him, and he waited. Every few nights, orders would come, an assault, a push against the perimeter. He would rise in the pre-dawn darkness, check his ammunition, and walk forward toward the sound of machine gun fire. If he was fortunate, he would return to his trench. If he was not, he would be carried back by stretcher bearers, and that required medical supplies, that required doctors who had to be fed, that required transport to move him to a field hospital. The system that sustained him consumed resources at an exponential rate, with each casualty, each assault, each futile attempt to break through. By summer, the siege had become something approaching a stalemate. Tobruk remained in British hands. Rommel remained unable to advance deeper into Libya without leaving the fortress contained but not conquered. And all the while, the supply line from Tripoli grew tighter, grew more fragile. A question began to form, quietly at first, and then with growing insistence. Was it worth it? Perhaps Rommel asked himself this question during a quiet evening in his tent, looking at reports of the daily supply figures, watching the numbers that represented ships sunk, fuel consumed, ammunition expended. Or perhaps he did not allow himself to ask it. The momentum of command, the seduction of continuing forward with tactics that had seemed to work in the past, the very difficulty of admitting that a course might be wrong, all of these things had a weight of their own. What seems clear, from the vantage point of distance, is that Tobruk was never truly the fortress itself that was the problem. It was what Tobruk represented, a limit, a boundary beyond which Rommel's logistics could not easily follow, a place where the dream of rapid advance met the reality of finite supply. The siege would eventually be lifted, not because it was won, but because Rommel's forces would be drawn away by operations further east, by the need to consolidate what had been gained and prepare for new offensive operations. And by then, the damage would be done. The supply lines would have been stressed to the breaking point. The reserves would be depleted. The arithmetic of the Desert War would have moved another increment closer to its inevitable conclusion. 300 miles north of the Cyrenaican coast, in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, lies an island barely larger than a city. Malta, just 67 square miles of limestone plateau and harbor inlets. Yet this small possession would prove to be one of the most consequential pieces of geography in the entire North African campaign. And what made Malta so quietly, relentlessly important was not its size, but its position, suspended between Sicily and North Africa like a stopper in a bottle, controlling the narrowest choke point of the central Mediterranean trade routes. To understand why Malta mattered so much to the equation that was slowly strangling the Afrika Korps, you must imagine the map as Rommel saw it. Every ton of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every spare engine block, destined for German and Italian forces in Libya, had to cross the sea. The direct route from Italian ports, from Naples, from Sicily, ran south and east through a corridor that passed within striking distance of Malta, and that is precisely where Malta's quiet power lay. The island had become, by 1941 and into 1942, a forward airfield and naval base from which the British could reach out and touch Axis convoys travelling to Africa. Consider what this meant in practical terms. An Italian merchant vessel, laden with precious fuel oil or ammunition, departing from Sicily with perhaps 800 tons in her hold, would sail south. The crew would know that somewhere along that route, perhaps 200 miles out, perhaps 300, British aircraft could find them. Submarines lurked below. Fast British destroyers operated from Alexandria. The voyage that should have been routine became a lottery, a desperate gamble that your ship might reach the North African coast before the island's reach found you. The British understood this before the Germans did. When Italy entered the war and North Africa became a theatre, Malta was already in British hands. Barely, and at great cost, but it was held. The Luftwaffe understood too, which is why Malta endured some of the heaviest bombing campaigns of the entire war. During 1941 and early 1942, German and Italian aircraft attacked the island relentlessly, attempting to destroy its airfields, its harbour facilities, its warehouses. There were periods when the island seemed on the edge of being starved into submission. The siege of Malta was, in many ways, a campaign running parallel to the Desert War itself, a struggle for survival that would ultimately reshape the fate of Rommel's army thousands of miles away. What must be understood is this: Malta was not conquered. Despite the ferocity of the air assault, despite the shortage of food and ammunition on the island itself, Malta held, and as long as Malta held, it remained a thorn in the side of every Axis convoy. This was not a glamorous form of warfare. There were no tank battles at Malta. There were no cavalry charges or dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, there was the quiet, grinding work of air reconnaissance, of submarine patrols, of fast attack craft striking at night. Yet this unglamorous work accumulated into something far more lethal than any single tactical victory in the desert. Consider the arithmetic. In early 1941, when Rommel first arrived in North Africa, the Axis still maintained reasonable supply lines. Italian ships ran relatively freely between Sicily and Libya. Malta existed, yes, but the Luftwaffe was strong, British aircraft were few, and the passage remained hazardous but not insurmountable. Convoy losses ran perhaps 15 to 20%, enough to be troubling, not enough to be catastrophic. But as 1941 progressed and 1942 arrived, something shifted. Malta grew stronger. More British fighters arrived on the island. The submarine flotilla was reinforced. New airfields were prepared. And Axis shipping losses crept upward. 20% became 30. 30 became 40. By mid-1942, during certain months, more than half of the supplies loaded onto ships in Sicily never reached Africa. Think about that for a moment. More than half. If you were loading 800 tons onto a vessel, only 400 tons might arrive. The other 400 tons sank in the Mediterranean, lost to bombs, to torpedoes, to gunfire in the darkness. From the German perspective, this represented a kind of multiplication of distance. The front line was 800 kilometers from Tripoli, but because of Malta, those 800 kilometers might as well have been 1,500. The losses compounded the effective length of the supply line. What made this worse, from Rommel's standpoint, was that it was largely invisible. The desert is visible. You can see tanks, vehicles, enemy positions. You can fight them. But Malta was 300 miles away. The losses happened at sea, beyond sight, and yet they determined whether a panzer division could move forward or must halt, because its fuel tanks were nearly empty. How maddening this must have been for a general trained in rapid maneuver, a tactician who understood mobile warfare, to find his movements constrained not by enemy armor, but by distant island whose air force he could not quite reach. The British, and later the Americans, understood Malta's value intimately. They poured supplies into the island at enormous cost and risk. Convoys running from Gibraltar to Malta endured losses as severe as those running to Egypt. Yet Malta was fed, Malta was defended, Malta was reinforced, because both Churchill and his commanders understood that this small island, with its harbour at Valletta, with its airfields at Lucca and Hal Far, was worth any sacrifice. It was worth more, perhaps, than a division of tanks. It was worth more than a victory in the desert, because it was not a victory but a strangulation, the slow, remorseless strangling of Axis supply arteries. By the time of the Gazala battles and the summer advance of 1942, Malta's impact was becoming undeniable in German intelligence reports. Supply officers noted, with increasing frustration, that convoy losses were consuming resources at rates no longer sustainable. For every ton of fuel that arrived, half a ton had been lost at sea. For every tank spare part that made the journey, another was sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean. A kind of invisible attrition was at work, separate from the battles in the desert, yet ultimately more decisive. What is perhaps most striking about Malta's role is how quietly it worked. There were no grand fleet battles there. There was no heroic last stand against overwhelming odds, though the island came close to that several times. Instead, Malta's importance was in persistence. It persisted as a base. It persisted in launching patrols. It persisted in surviving the bombs and the shortages. And in that simple persistence, it slowly, relentlessly altered the balance of supply upon which Rommel depended. One might ask, as historians do, whether the Afrika Korps would have succeeded in conquering Egypt if Malta had fallen. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. The mathematics of supply suggest that even with Malta defeated, the distances were simply too great. But Malta forced those mathematics to play out faster, more dramatically. It shortened the timeline in which Axis supplies could sustain forward movement. It meant that Rommel's window of opportunity, his chance to break through British defences and reach Cairo, was narrower than it might otherwise have been. In essence, Malta was not just a British possession, it was a compression of time, an acceleration of the strategic clock. And here lies a curious irony. Malta was conquered in neither the literal sense nor the figurative sense, yet it conquered the Axis supply strategy in North Africa. An island fortress that never fell did more to defeat Rommel's army than armies that did defeat him in battle. In the ledgers and charts that military historians still study, there are columns for tank production, aircraft sorties, casualty figures, and fuel consumption rates. But there are no rows for exhaustion. There are no entries for the trembling hands of a truck driver after 18 hours on the desert track, or the salt-crusted uniforms of Italian dock workers who loaded cargo in the Libyan heat until their legs would barely hold them. And yet those men, countless thousands of them, mostly forgotten even in their own countries, these were the men who actually decided whether Rommel advanced or retreated, whether his army ate or starved, whether the guns could fire, or fell silent from want of ammunition. Consider for a moment the fate of a German driver in the Afrika Korps. His name was unremarkable, lost now to time as most were. He drove a Kessbohrer truck, a 6-ton vehicle designed originally for carrying supplies across the Reich's smooth autobahns and well-maintained roads. The Sahara was something else entirely. The engine would whine at temperatures that sometimes topped 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Sand worked into every gasket, every bearing, every moving part. The tires wore thin on the sharp flint and scattered rocks that might or might not appear around the next dune. A single round-trip journey from Tripoli to Tobruk might take him 70 hours, sometimes 80 if the going was bad, if a vehicle ahead had broken down and blocked the narrow track that passed for a road, if his fuel gauge suggested he might not quite make it, and he had to nurse the engine along at a crawl to stretch every litre. What did such a driver eat? Biscuits, mostly. Hard biscuits that could break a tooth if you weren't careful. Water in a canvas bag that hung from the side of the cabin, where the heat turned it lukewarm and faintly salty with the sweat of your own hands that had held it. Every few trips, if he was lucky, some preserved meat, hard as cork and flavoured with salt to preserve it through the heat. There was no air conditioning, of course, no cab insulation. Just him, the engine's roar, the grinding of gears, and the endless sameness of the landscape rolling past, hour after hour, while the sun burned and the sand blew, and his fingers gripped the wheel with the kind of white-knuckled tension that meant he was fighting to stay awake, knowing that a single moment of drowsiness might send him into a ditch or into the path of a convoy coming the other way. These drivers were not special. They were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were conscripted men, or in some cases, men who had simply been assigned to the African campaign as a matter of military necessity. They had families at home, presumably, though there was little time to think about that. They had lives they wanted to return to, but for months, sometimes for years, their entire existence was reduced to this: the road, the truck, the next load of fuel drums or ammunition or food that had to reach the front, because if it did not, someone else would die. A gunner would lack ammunition. A tank crew would run out of fuel and have to abandon their machine. An infantry platoon would go without bread. The question that rarely surfaces in the strategic narratives is this: how did these men endure? And the answer, it seems, is that they did not quite, not fully, not without cost. The Mediterranean campaign, particularly the North African theatre, consumed men in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Heat exhaustion claimed some. Accidents, vehicles rolling over, collisions in the dark, mechanical failures that stranded drivers miles from help, claimed others. Disease, dysentery from contaminated water or food, simple infection from a cut or scrape that turned septic in the desert sun. The official records called these losses non-battle casualties, a phrase that somehow makes them seem less real, less tragic. And there were the Italian sailors. Italy's navy was, in many respects, outmatched from the start of the North African campaign. The submarines were aging, the destroyers few, the supply convoys vulnerable. An Italian merchant sailor knew, consciously or not, that each journey across the Mediterranean might be his last. The British had submarines patrolling those waters. The RAF flew missions from Egypt and increasingly from Malta. A single torpedo could transform a ship carrying 2,000 tons of supplies into a burning wreck sliding beneath the waves. The men aboard, sailors, cargo handlers, officers, would disappear. Months later, perhaps, a letter would arrive at a home in Naples or Sicily or Rome. The Navy regrets to inform you. How many Italian transport ships were sunk? The numbers vary depending on the source, but by the end of the campaign, it was substantial. Hundreds of vessels damaged or lost. and each one represented not merely material lost, but men dead, men who had not wanted to be there, many of them sailors conscripted into service by a regime that had chosen to ally itself with Nazi Germany. They died in the Mediterranean, in the cold, dark water, far from home, because the Axis powers needed supplies to fight in North Africa. The dock workers themselves, stationed in Tripoli and Benghazi, worked in conditions that would seem almost medieval by later standards. Cranes and derricks, yes, but many were hand-operated or powered by small diesel engines that frequently broke down. The work was purely manual. Men with ropes and pulleys, loading cargo onto trucks. The heat was murder. The dust was thick. Injuries were common. Fingers lost to rope. Backs broken lifting ammunition cases. Dehydration leading to collapse. The pay was poor. The food was meager. And the knowledge that enemy aircraft might come at any moment and destroy the work you had just completed, or kill you in the process, lent a kind of desperate futility to the labor. In a certain sense, the entire Afrika Korps was a supply system shaped like an army. It was not the tanks and the guns and the tactical brilliance that kept the campaign alive, though all of those mattered. It was the infrastructure of movement, the routes from port to front, the depots, the drivers, the sailors, the men with shovels and sweat, who moved ton after ton of fuel and food and ammunition across impossible distances. And when that system began to falter, as we will see, the army itself began to falter, no matter how brilliant its commander might be, no matter how superior its tactics in any given engagement. The paradox of Rommel's campaign was that his greatest strength, his mobility, his willingness to take risks, his ability to move quickly and strike hard, required, almost as a condition of existence, a supply system that was never quite adequate to the task. Every mile eastward from Tripoli meant the convoys had to travel longer. Every mile stretched the chain thinner, and the men who kept that chain moving, the drivers and sailors and dock workers, grew progressively more exhausted, more desperate, more aware that they were fighting a war not against the enemy, though they were doing that too, but against distance itself, against the desert, against the simple physics of moving material across a continent. In the coming days and nights of this narrative, as we move through the campaigns and the battles and the grand strategic movements, it is worth keeping these men in mind, not as statistics, not as abstract entries in a logistics table, but as humans enduring something very close to unbearable. They did not make the headlines. Their names do not appear in most histories, but they decided the war. The autumn of 1941 fell across North Africa with a particular kind of heaviness, a weight that came not from the sky, but from the earth itself, from the stretching sinews of supply lines that had begun, almost imperceptibly at first, to fray. Rommel's victories through summer and into early autumn had created an almost intoxicating momentum. His forces had pushed eastward nearly to the gates of Egypt, and the newspapers in Berlin spoke of triumph imminent. But in the quiet corridors of headquarters, in the ledgers of quartermasters, in the hold spaces of Italian cargo ships struggling across the Mediterranean, a different arithmetic was unfolding. The further forward the Afrika Korps advanced, the more the mathematics of distance began to betray them. On November 18th, the British launched Operation Crusader, an offensive designed to relieve the garrison at Tobruk and push Rommel back westward. But here is a subtle truth that often escapes the sweeping narratives of battle. Crusader was not primarily a confrontation of tanks and tactics, though those elements certainly mattered. What truly decided the campaign was invisible to most observers. It was a collapse of supply. Rommel found himself, after the initial shock of contact, increasingly unable to sustain his forward positions. His trucks, which had been groaning under the weight of extended lines all autumn, began breaking down with accelerating frequency. Fuel became not merely scarce but episodically vanishing. Officers reported running vehicles on fumes, making calculations measured not in gallons but in litres, sometimes in individual cans. Consider for a moment the peculiar vulnerability of a force so far from its sources of supply. Rommel's main bases were at Tripoli and Benghazi, both on the western coast. His advanced units, seeking to trap and destroy British forces around Tobruk and potentially push into Egypt, had extended themselves nearly 500 kilometers forward. Every shell, every drop of fuel, every replacement part, every ration of bread and tinned meat had to travel that immense distance across a desert that offered no comfort, no shelter for supply convoys, and increasingly, no guarantee of arrival. British air raids and submarine attacks on the Mediterranean had begun to bite more deeply. The Luftwaffe, which had provided a degree of air superiority throughout much of the campaign, faced new pressures and could not be everywhere at once. What happened during Operation Crusader was not that Rommel's armies were simply outnumbered or outmaneuvered on the battlefield, though both were partially true. What happened was that his supply situation, already strained to near breaking, finally fractured. In late November and into December, German and Italian units found themselves unable to maintain the tempo of operations. Fuel shortages forced a slowing of movement just when tactical circumstances demanded rapid response. The British, meanwhile, drawing from their bases in Egypt and receiving supplies from across the Indian Ocean, operated from a position of relative abundance. They could afford attrition, the Axis could not. The psychological effect of this privation rippled through the German command structure. Rommel, a general accustomed to aggressive action and the seizing of initiative, found himself constrained by logistics in a way that his tactical brilliance could not overcome. He could see the opportunities on the map. He could envision the maneuvers that might yet snatch victory. But his supply officers reported, again and again, that there was no fuel to sustain them. There were no reserves, there was only the bare minimum needed to hold what had been won, and increasingly, even that began to seem doubtful. By early December, Rommel made a decision that would echo through the remaining months of the campaign. He would withdraw, not in collapse, not in panic, but in a disciplined retreat that would take him back westward, across the same ground he had so triumphantly crossed months before. It was a strategic acknowledgement of an uncomfortable reality that his enemy, despite apparent setbacks in individual engagements, possessed an advantage that no amount of tactical agility could overcome. The British had the capacity to sustain their forces indefinitely across vast distances. The Axis did not. The winter retreat of 1941 was, in many ways, the true turning point of the Desert Campaign, though few recognized it at the time. Rommel's forces had not been decisively beaten in open battle. In fact, in several engagements during Crusader, German and Italian units inflicted heavy losses on their opponents. But they had been defeated by the limitations of their own supply system, by the simple fact that an army marching into a desert cannot march farther than its supplies allow. Every kilometer of advance meant that supply lines grew longer. Every engagement meant that stocks of ammunition were consumed and had to be replaced. Every day of operation meant that fuel reserves diminished and could only be replenished from distant harbors, across contested waters, by way of supply lines that were themselves under increasingly heavy attack. The soldiers and officers who lived through this period spoke, in letters and later memoirs, of a particular frustration. They had not felt the sting of defeat in the traditional sense. They had not been routed or surrounded or compelled to surrender. They had simply, by degrees, lost the capacity to continue their offensive. It was as if the desert itself, through the agency of supply shortages, had enforced a boundary they could not cross. The machines they commanded, the men they led, all required sustenance. And that sustenance, when reckoned against the distances involved, proved insufficient. What is perhaps most striking about the winter crisis of 1941 is how completely it vindicated the concerns that logisticians and supply officers had been raising for months. Rommel had gambled, as he so often did, on the possibility that speed and boldness might achieve what supply lines could not sustain. The gamble had partially succeeded. His advance had been remarkable. But it had failed in its ultimate objective. The British were not pushed out of North Africa. Tobruk was not conquered. Egypt remained beyond his reach. And by December, as his forces withdrew under the pressure not of enemy armies but of their own material insufficiency, it became evident that the Desert War would not be decided by the general who could maneuver most skillfully, but by the belligerent who could sustain longer supply lines over greater distances with more reliable logistics. The retreat itself became a kind of grim tutorial in the limits of ambition. Rommel's columns moved westward through December and into January, pursued not aggressively, but methodically by the British. There was no sense of catastrophe, no dramatic finale of the sort that appeals to the imagination. There was only the slow, steady acknowledgement that he had gone as far as he could go. The supplies simply would not permit anything more. The winter of 1941 had broken Rommel's momentum, and as the cold months softened into spring, something remarkable and temporary shifted across the Mediterranean. For the first time since the Afrika Korps arrived in Libya, the balance of power at sea and in the air tilted just slightly in the Axis favor. It was a window, narrow and fleeting, but during those months of early 1942, something approaching genuine supply abundance reached the German and Italian forces in North Africa. The trucks that arrived carried not just the bare minimum to keep the army moving, but surplus. Fuel tanks that had been carefully rationed were suddenly, briefly, full. And in that ephemeral season of plenty, Rommel sensed opportunity like a hawk sensing wind currents shifting overhead. The change had several fathers. The Luftwaffe, strengthened by reinforcements and reorganized under more efficient command structures, had begun to establish something closer to air superiority over the central Mediterranean and the North African littoral. German fighters, particularly the Messerschmitt 109s, were taking a heavier toll on British shipping and aircraft. At the same time, the Italian Navy, which had for so long struggled against British naval forces, managed to concentrate enough power around their own supply runs to push convoys through with fewer losses. And perhaps most crucially, Malta, that thorn that had festered in Axis flesh for months, had been subjected to such relentless bombing campaigns that its ability to project power against shipping routes had diminished substantially. The island's airfields were cratered, its aircraft depleted, its supplies running low. For those few months, Malta was more symbol than sword. The arithmetic of it was profound. Where perhaps only 30 or 40% of Axis supply ships had been reaching port in the preceding months, that figure rose significantly. Some historians suggest rates climbed towards 60 or even 70%, enough to move from crisis management into something resembling planning. Italian fast cruisers and destroyers, the small, swift ships that could dash across the Mediterranean under cover of darkness, began to run with less fear of interception. German submarines, though few in the Mediterranean itself, helped ensure that major warships were forced to keep distance from Axis convoy routes. The British, stretched thin and fighting on multiple fronts, could not maintain the pressure they had exerted during the worst months of Malta's siege. It is worth pausing here to understand what this truly meant on the ground in North Africa. Rommel's divisions had grown accustomed to functioning on perhaps 70% of their theoretical supply requirement. They had learned to squeeze every litre of fuel into careful calculations, to move not with the exuberance of abundance, but with the conservatism of scarcity. Now, suddenly, that pressure eased. Fuel depots at Tripoli and Benghazi began to accumulate reserves instead of dwindling toward empty. Ammunition trucks arrived with regularity, rather than as rare interruptions. Even the German and Italian soldiers themselves, who had eaten monotonous rations and swallowed dust for months, began to receive marginally more adequate food. The morale effect was noticeable, though perhaps harder to quantify than the physical supplies themselves. And Rommel, who was above all else a man of movement and decisiveness, recognized immediately what this window meant. The British, though they had successfully halted him at the gates of Tobruk the previous autumn, were still weaker in armor and numbers than he might wish. Their supply situation in turn was complex. They too were dependent on long lines stretching back toward Egypt and the Suez. If he could move quickly now, while his own supplies were comparatively generous, he might achieve what he had failed to achieve before. The seduction of momentum, that ancient affliction of commanders, settled over his headquarters again like a familiar embrace. In June of 1942, Rommel launched his assault on Gazala, a small coastal position where the British had assembled a defensive line intended to protect their hold on Tobruk and the Libyan coast beyond it. The battle itself was not a simple affair. It involved feinting movements, regrouping, and complex maneuvers by both sides. But what distinguished this moment from earlier campaigns in the desert was something quieter and less visible to the eye. Rommel had fuel enough to maneuver. He had ammunition enough to sustain offensive operations. His supply lines, though still stretched, were no longer operating at the edge of catastrophic failure. When his armoured columns swept around the British flank, it was not desperation driving them forward, but something closer to confidence. The German panzers moved with a fluidity that had been impossible in the previous year. The fall of Gazala came in June, and with it opened the road to Tobruk itself. Here is where the story becomes particularly poignant and perhaps worth sitting with for a moment. Tobruk, that fortress which had absorbed months of bombardment and siege the previous year, which had become a symbol of British resistance, fell in a single day in June of 1942. The speed of its collapse still startles historians. Australian and South African infantry, defending concrete bunkers and makeshift positions, found themselves surrounded and overrun in what became a rout rather than an orderly retreat. Thousands of men surrendered. The fall of Tobruk sent shockwaves through British command and through London itself. Churchill himself, sitting in the War Cabinet offices, received the news with particular dismay, as if a personal blow had landed. What had enabled this rupture in the British defences was, at its core, not a revolutionary tactic or brilliant manoeuvre, though Rommel would certainly be credited with both. It was, rather, the simple fact that for a few precious weeks, the Axis supply system had functioned well enough to provide the necessary margin of superiority. The German tanks were not numerous, far fewer than the British inventory of armour, but the German divisions could operate with less wastage, less friction, less mechanical breakdown, because they were properly supplied. The Italian infantry, fighting alongside the Germans, could sustain operations because ammunition and food were arriving with something approaching regularity. This was not abundance by the standards of well-supplied armies operating in Europe or North Africa with secure rear areas, but it was, by the standards of the Desert War, a kind of surfeit. And here is the cruel irony that would come to dominate the months that followed. This brief period of relative plenty blinded Rommel and his superiors to a fundamental truth. The further his army advanced past Gazala and beyond Tobruk, the thinner his supply lines stretched. Every mile eastward meant that convoys travelled longer to reach the front, that fuel was consumed in transit, that wear and tear on trucks accelerated. The window of plenty had not solved the underlying geometry of the problem. It had merely postponed the reckoning. Rommel's very success in breaking through British defences and advancing into Egypt was simultaneously tightening the noose around his own logistics. The supply depots of North Africa were falling behind him. The ports of Tripoli and Benghazi grew ever more distant. And meanwhile, he was advancing toward the British heartland, toward Egypt, toward Cairo, toward a place where British supplies were short, but British numbers and reinforcements were potentially limitless. By August of 1942, that brief window was beginning to close. British power in the air and at sea, though temporarily eclipsed, was beginning to reassert itself. Malta, reinforced and resupplied, was coming back to life as a Corsair stronghold. British aircraft, newly arriving in North Africa, were making Axis convoy routes more treacherous. Submarines, both British and other Allied vessels, were sinking transport ships at increasing rates. The abundance of early summer was giving way to scarcity again, but this time Rommel and his army were further from home, more dependent than ever on that fragile supply chain, and facing an enemy that was growing stronger by the day. The high water mark of Axis success in the Desert War was approaching, not in the exultation of victory, but in the quiet mathematics of supply shortfall and exhaustion. By the summer of 1942, in the weeks just before the first great clash at El Alamein, something had shifted in the mathematics of the desert. Rommel had achieved what seemed impossible, a moment of supply sufficiency that allowed him to push farther east than any German commander had yet reached in North Africa. His divisions were moving toward El Alamein, that narrow corridor of land between the Mediterranean and the impassable Qattara Depression. And for perhaps the first time since his arrival in Libya, the Afrika Korps felt something that resembled genuine momentum. And yet, if you traced those supply lines backward on a map, following the convoys westward through the Libyan desert toward Tripoli and then farther still toward the harbors that fed them, you would see the truth written in simple geography. The distance had become almost incomprehensible. Nearly 1,000 miles now separated Rommel's forward divisions from his main supply depots. 1,000 miles across open desert, across roads that were often little more than tracks worn into sand by the passage of thousands of vehicles, roads that had to be maintained constantly against the desert's patient efforts to reclaim them. 1,000 miles meant that a fuel truck leaving Tripoli in the morning might spend 3 or 4 days simply reaching the front line, only to discharge its cargo and begin the long journey back again. When you do the mathematics of that journey, when you account for the fuel that the truck itself consumed getting there, for the wear on engines and tires, for the inevitable breakdowns and repairs, the margin between supply and need had become a knife's edge. Fuel was measured now not in weeks or even in days. The German divisions were operating on fuel measured in hours, 48 hours, 72 hours at most. A panzer division required on average some 300 tons of fuel and supplies daily just to maintain its position, more if it was advancing or maneuvering. The Luftwaffe too was voracious. Every sortie required fuel, every landing required fuel. Every single hour of air superiority demanded fuel that had to traverse that 1,000-mile thread of supply. Rommel himself seemed caught between the clarity of the situation and the seduction of proximity to a goal. Alexandria lay beyond El Alamein. Egypt lay beyond Alexandria. The Suez Canal, the artery of the British Empire, the key to control of the Eastern Mediterranean, and perhaps the Middle East itself, lay in that direction, and in the summer of 1942 it seemed almost within reach. You can sense in the German commander's messages from this period a tension between what he knew about his supply situation and what his ambition suggested was possible. The enemy was weakening, he believed. One more push, one more offensive, just a little more fuel, a little more time. But the supply lines did not lie, and they did not bend to ambition. Every mile that the Afrika Korps advanced was a mile that stretched those arteries thinner. Every advancing division meant depots left behind growing more distant, meant that the marginal fuel truck, the one that might have made the difference, was now burning more of its precious cargo simply in transit than it was delivering. The harbours of Tripoli and Benghazi, distant and vulnerable as they were, suddenly seemed not distant enough. They seemed, in fact, impossibly far away. There was another factor too, something quieter and less visible, but no less destructive. The British, in the months preceding El Alamein, had begun a systematic campaign of interdiction on the Mediterranean crossing itself. Submarines ranged more boldly. Malta, that thorn in the Axis side, had been resupplied just enough by the British to become dangerous again. Air power, British Beaufighters and Wellingtons striking at night, operating from airfields in Egypt and from the island fortress itself, had begun to exact a toll on the Italian convoys that brought supplies across from Italy. The percentages of supplies that actually reached North Africa, rather than resting on the bottom of the Mediterranean, were declining, slowly, measurably, relentlessly. And yet the advance continued. The offensive pushed forward in late August. Rommel attacked at Alam el Halfa, attempting to work around the British positions from the south. It was, in its way, a final gasp of the old momentum, the last occasion on which German armour would achieve tactical success in the desert. But success, by this point, had become divorced from strategy. You could win a battle and still lose the war, because the war was not decided by the possession of ground. It was decided by tons per day, by gallons per mile, by the inexorable arithmetic of industrial capacity and logistical reach. Consider, for a moment, what it meant to fuel a panzer division in the desert. Not just to fill the tanks that one time, but to maintain it day after day, week after week. A single Panzer IV tank required somewhere between 40 and 50 gallons of fuel daily, assuming light operations. With ammunition and rations for the crew, you were looking at nearly a ton of supplies per day for a single tank. A panzer division might contain 100 tanks or more, plus trucks, plus reconnaissance vehicles, plus the entire infrastructure of supply and maintenance. That was 5,000 or 6,000 tons of supplies weekly, perhaps more. And that was just one division. Rommel had multiple divisions in the field. Now trace that demand backward across 1,000 miles of desert. Account for wastage, for spillage, for the vehicles that broke down and had to be abandoned because there was no fuel to repair them, for the journeys that convoys made empty on the return trip, for the friction of distance itself. The numbers became dreamlike, impossible. They suggested that the entire operation was balanced on a foundation that could not hold its own weight. Perhaps Rommel knew this. Perhaps he felt the thinness of the thread even as he committed his divisions to one more offensive. The German commander had always been a gambler, a believer in the power of will and audacity to overcome obstacles that seemed merely numerical. But the desert did not reward will. It simply destroyed machines and men with patient indifference, regardless of their determination. By late August 1942, the supply depots behind the front contained fuel for perhaps 2 weeks of active operations, 3 weeks if the divisions did not move. That was all, a few weeks of fuel, stretched thin across machines that required constant feeding, separated from their source by a 1,000-mile thread that the enemy was actively working to sever. And on the other side of the line, to the east, at El Alamein, a British army was assembling. An army that did not have to worry about 1,000-mile supply lines. An army that was being fed by a supply base at Cairo, only 100 miles away. An army that was receiving reinforcements, replacements, ammunition, and fuel almost without limit from the factories of Britain and America. The high water mark of the Afrika Korps was not measured in territory or in the distance travelled eastward. It was measured in the moment just before exhaustion became absolute, in those final days before the realization that the supply lines could not sustain the ambition any longer. Rommel's division stood at El Alamein in the late summer of 1942, poised for one more effort, one more surge toward the unreachable goal. But behind them stretched 990 miles of desert, and along that entire distance the supply chain was thinning, fraying, approaching the breaking point. The battle for El Alamein would be fought soon enough, but it was already lost before the first shot, lost in the arithmetic of logistics, lost in the simple fact that one army was near to its source of supply and another was nearly 1,000 miles away from its own. Now, beneath the thunder of tank tracks and the roar of dive bombers, there existed a quieter mathematics, one that would ultimately prove far more decisive than any tactical maneuver or bold flanking movement. It was the mathematics of fuel, and it operated with absolute, unforgiving precision across every mile of the North African desert. A panzer division, when fully operational and engaged in active campaigning, consumed approximately 5,000 to 7,000 gallons of fuel per day. This was not a figure plucked from thin air or derived from peacetime training exercises. It emerged from the brutal arithmetic of desert warfare itself, a landscape where vehicles could not move without burning fuel, where every engagement required movement, and where movement without fuel meant immobility, which in desert warfare often meant death. The 21st Panzer Division, one of the German formations that would come to define the Afrika Korps' desperate struggle, needed roughly this amount simply to maintain its operational posture. That figure included not only the panzers themselves, those mechanical beasts that demanded gallons like thirsty animals at a waterhole, but also the trucks that supplied them, the half-tracks that carried ammunition, the reconnaissance vehicles that ranged ahead into the emptiness, and the motorized infantry that had become inseparable from mechanized warfare. Consider, if you will, what this meant in practical terms. A single Panzer III or IV, depending on its model and the conditions under which it operated, would consume somewhere between 50 and 70 litres, roughly 13 to 18 gallons, per 100 kilometres of travel. This was not in combat, this was simply moving. A division might advance or reposition across 50 kilometres in a day of operations. That single movement consumed tens of thousands of gallons across all its vehicles. Then add reconnaissance missions, tactical repositioning, withdrawal under pressure, and the constant need to maintain supply lines that stretched rearward like fragile umbilical cords across the desert. The fuel consumption mounted with inexorable mathematics. Yet the Axis convoys arriving at Tripoli or Benghazi, those tired Italian and German truck columns that had crossed the sea at such cost and danger, never quite delivered what was needed. Why? The answer lay not in any single failure, but in a cascade of competing demands and cascading insufficiencies that accumulated over every mile of the supply route. A convoy might deliver, on an optimistic day, perhaps 800 to 1,000 tons of cargo to the ports of Libya. Of this, fuel comprised perhaps 40 to 50% of the total tonnage, 400 tons, sometimes more. This sounds substantial until you begin to convert it into gallons and litres, and then distribute that amount across an entire army, spread across a front line that grew longer with each advance. The transportation burden itself consumed fuel. The trucks that carried fuel burned fuel to carry that fuel. This was not a paradox unique to the desert, but in North Africa it became almost grotesquely apparent. A truck that could carry 10 tons of fuel would burn perhaps 2 tons of that fuel simply in the journey from Tripoli, or later from Benghazi, to an advanced supply dump 400 or 500 kilometers to the east. The mathematics grew worse the farther the front advanced. Consider the perspective of a supply officer, a tired, dust-covered German or Italian major, tasked with moving resources from the coast to the fighting units. Each kilometer eastward multiplied the fuel consumed in delivery. Moving a ton of fuel from Tripoli to Benghazi was one equation. Moving that same ton from Benghazi to Bardia was a different, costlier equation. Moving it from Bardia toward the advanced positions near Tobruk or beyond became nearly impossible without consuming half the shipment in the delivery itself. The heat of the desert added its own cruel efficiency to this fuel mathematics. Engines that would function adequately in European climates labored in the Sahara. Cooling systems worked harder. Fuel evaporation was not merely theoretical, it was a tangible loss. Stored in drums exposed to the desert sun, gasoline and diesel did not remain stable. Seals leaked. Metal drums warped. In the summer months, fuel loss through evaporation alone might account for 10 to 15% of supplies simply sitting in a depot. It was fuel that never reached an engine, fuel that dissipated into the shimmering air as invisible loss. What, then, could realistically be delivered to the front line? The consensus among Axis logistical planners suggested that with enormous effort, with near-perfect coordination, and with favorable conditions at sea, perhaps 2,000 to 2,500 tons of all cargo could be landed in Libya per week. Of this, if fuel remained at 40% of the cargo manifest, that meant perhaps 800 to 1,000 tons of fuel arriving per week. Over 7 days, this was roughly 140 tons per day, roughly 42,000 gallons, to speak in measures more familiar to the tank crews who depended upon it. Spread across a division consuming 5,000 to 7,000 gallons daily, this was technically enough, but only if nothing went wrong, only if no convoy was sunk, only if no submarine appeared off Tripoli, only if the air raids stopped, only if there were no mechanical breakdowns in the trucks themselves, only if the unloading facilities operated at maximum efficiency, only if the desert trucks did not suffer the countless small failures that accumulated across dozens of vehicles in that hostile environment. In practice, matters rarely aligned so neatly. What Rommel's divisions actually received, particularly as the front advanced eastward, was consistently less than what the mathematics suggested should be possible. In the spring of 1941, when the Afrika Korps was still relatively small and operations confined to the area around Benghazi, supply might be adequate, even approaching plenty. But as momentum seized Rommel's imagination, as each victory seemed to promise another, the gap between supply needed and supply received began to widen like a crack in the desert floor. The divisions pressed eastward, faster than the supply lines could extend. They won tactical engagements, they captured territory, they achieved what appeared to be operational success. But with each step forward, each tank that rumbled deeper into the desert, the supply position grew more precarious. Think of it this way: a panzer division at the gates of Tripoli could be supplied almost passably. That same division, 2 months later, positioned near Benghazi, required proportionally more fuel to maintain the same operational readiness simply because the route was longer. 3 months later, as divisions ranged toward Tobruk and prepared for operations beyond, the mathematical impossibility became almost grotesquely apparent. The vehicles that would deliver the fuel burned the fuel. The longer the journey, the more fuel burned. Eventually, the point approached and then crossed, where supplying the front consumed nearly as much fuel as the front itself used in operations. It was a treadmill accelerating, and the Axis convoys were gradually falling behind the pace. By the summer of 1942, something quietly fundamental had shifted in the Mediterranean. The Axis had enjoyed, for a few brief months, a window of air and sea superiority that had allowed fuel and ammunition to flow almost reliably eastward toward Egypt. Rommel had felt it. His tanks had rolled forward with almost careless momentum. But that window, narrow and temporary as all windows are in war, was closing. And closing not because of some sudden clash of battleships or a dramatic raid, but because of the slow, patient work of men reading enemy signals in a country house in England, and because of a small island in the middle of the sea that refused to be conquered. Bletchley Park, in Buckinghamshire, had long since begun to unravel the German Enigma code. But the breakthrough that mattered most to the Afrika Korps came in a different direction entirely. The British signals intelligence teams had begun intercepting the Italian naval codes, the ciphers that protected the convoy schedules, the fuel manifests, the ship movement orders that governed every supply run across the Mediterranean. Once you could read your enemy's schedule, once you knew not merely where they were sending supplies but when, and by which route, and in which ships, everything changed. It was as if the British had acquired an invisible hand that could reach across the sea and pluck away the vital traffic before it ever reached North Africa. And Malta had become, against all odds and all German expectations, the instrument through which those signals were transformed into action. The island fortress had been bombarded mercilessly in 1941 and early 1942. The Germans had thrown everything at it: Stukas diving from the sky, mines in the harbour, submarine attacks on the relief convoys struggling to reach the island with food and fuel. Malta had been on the edge of starvation. There were moments when British command genuinely wondered if the island could hold, yet it held. And as the summer of 1942 deepened, the island began to recover. Fresh fighters arrived. The submarine base, which had never quite closed, began to expand again, and the bombers, the RAF's Beauforts and Wellingtons, the American medium bombers, began flying out from Malta's airfields with renewed frequency, armed with the knowledge that Bletchley Park had provided. Think for a moment about what this meant in practical terms. An Italian convoy would depart from Naples or Palermo carrying, say, 3,000 tons of fuel in drums, destined for Tripoli. The convoy commander would file his route plan, his timing, his escort strength. That information would be encoded and transmitted. But the British were reading it almost as it was being sent. The moment was crystalline and strange, the Germans and Italians sending their supply ships forth with only the invisible confidence that comes from secrecy, unaware that their every move was being watched, anticipated, and arranged against. It was a profoundly unequal contest, and yet it played out in almost complete silence. The submarines operated first. Based in Malta, they prowled the shipping lanes with a deliberation that spoke to their newfound knowledge. A U-class submarine, or one of the larger boats, would position itself along a predicted convoy route, and when the merchant ships and their escorts appeared almost exactly where and when they had said they would, the submarine would strike. Torpedoes would find their marks, ships would burn and sink, and the supplies they carried, fuel, ammunition, food, medicines, would vanish into the depths of the Mediterranean, written off as loss, rather than ever reaching the waiting trucks and depots of the Panzerarmee Afrika. By late summer of 1942, the interdiction was becoming systematic. It was no longer the occasional lucky sinking, the random encounter with an enemy convoy. It had become routine, almost bureaucratic in its precision. Day after day, night after night, British aircraft and submarines would find Axis convoys and attack them. The Italian crews, brave men in their own right, would fight back as best they could, but they were fighting a war in which half their enemy could see in the dark, so to speak. They could not win encounters that were staged, timed, and arranged in advance against them. What did this mean for the fuel situation at the front? It meant that the theoretical tonnage required, those vast daily demands that logistics officers scribbled onto their charts and sent back to Rome and Berlin, became almost irrelevant, because the actual tonnage that arrived was considerably less. A convoy that was scheduled to deliver 500 tons might see 2 ships sunk, 300 tons lost. The mathematics became grimly reliable. For every 5 convoys dispatched, perhaps 3 would complete the journey. For every 3 that completed it, the contents would be consumed or damaged or diverted. What reached the front, week after week, was always less than what was needed, and this was something that could not be solved by better tactics or bolder commanders. Rommel could not outmaneuver a submarine that was waiting for his supply ship in waters he could not reach. He could not defeat an RAF bomber squadron by aggressive deployment. There was nothing he could do, from his tent in the desert 1,000 kilometers away, about the fact that his supply lines were being slowly strangled by an enemy that operated in a realm he could not touch. The Germans and Italians tried, certainly. They increased escort strength. They attempted to run more convoys more frequently, hoping that numbers would overcome the losses. They invested in new ships, faster ships, ships that might evade attacks more successfully. These efforts had some effect. They were not meaningless, but they could not overcome the fundamental advantage that the British possessed, the ability to see, to know, and to act upon that knowledge with speed and coordination. Malta's airfields could launch fighters and bombers within minutes of receiving intelligence. Submarines could maneuver into position based on predicted convoy routes. The entire British Mediterranean command structure was becoming a responsive, coordinated instrument of interdiction, and the Axis supply system was learning, day by day, week by week, that it could not sustain itself against such pressure. There is something almost melancholy about studying this period from the perspective of supply officers and captains of merchant ships. The individual battles, the sinking of the Proserpina, the loss of the transport Reichenfels, the dozen small freighters that went down almost without notice, these were tragedies for the men aboard them. They were Italian sailors, German sailors, some conscripted, some volunteers, all of them far from home, attempting to deliver cargo across hostile waters. Many of them did not survive their ships' deaths. Those who did, pulled from the water or picked up by rescue vessels, would find themselves in prisoner-of-war camps, their war over, their names recorded in the logbooks of their sunken vessels, and largely forgotten by history. Yet from a larger perspective, from the viewpoint of the strategist or the historian, what was happening was something almost impersonal and inevitable. The supply line was being strangulated, not all at once, not in some dramatic coup, but slowly, relentlessly, with the quiet persistence of a siege. The noose was tightening. Each month that passed saw more tonnage sunk, more merchant ships lost, more crews killed. The rate of loss was becoming unsustainable. Axis production could not replace the ships fast enough. Axis shipyards could not build new vessels at the rate they were being destroyed. The arithmetic of convoy warfare, when examined month by month, told a story that was written in the statistics of sinkings and deliveries, in the declining proportion of supplies that actually made landfall in North Africa versus those that disappeared into the sea. What Rommel could sense, in his messages to higher command and in the increasingly desperate tone of his supply officers' reports, was that something fundamental had shifted. The window of abundance had closed. The period in which he might have had enough, truly enough, not merely barely sufficient, was passing. And what was replacing it was something far more difficult, a prolonged period of shortage, in which every gallon of fuel would need to be carefully apportioned, in which every supply truck that was destroyed in combat could not be easily replaced, in which the simple mathematics of consumption and delivery was beginning to tilt decisively against him. The British, meanwhile, were learning the lesson that modern warfare had been slowly teaching since the First World War, that the side with the better supply line, with the capacity to move more material forward more reliably, had an advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance could fully overcome. It was not the most exciting lesson, perhaps. It did not make for dramatic stories, but it was proving, in this quiet strangulation of the Axis supply system, to be the truest lesson of all. By the late summer of 1942, the desert had become a place of waiting. Both armies, exhausted and overextended, faced each other across a narrow funnel of land near a railway halt called El Alamein, where the Qattara Depression rose like an impassable wall on the south and the Mediterranean lay hard to the north. The space between these two barriers was perhaps 40 miles wide, and it was here, in the cooling dusk of August and into the hot autumn months that followed, that the arithmetic of supply would finally and decisively overtake the mathematics of maneuver. General Bernard Montgomery had arrived in North Africa with instructions that seemed almost deceptively simple. Hold. Do not retreat further. The British had been pushed back across Libya with such speed and such seeming inevitability that Cairo itself had begun to feel unsafe. Montgomery was told to consolidate, to prepare defences, and above all, to avoid the kind of catastrophic defeat that had characterized so much of the Desert War. Yet Montgomery, a general whose reputation rested as much on his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail as on his tactical innovations, understood something that Rommel could no longer afford to ignore. He had time, he had supplies, and he had the luxury of not moving forward until everything was perfectly prepared. Consider the difference in their circumstances. Montgomery commanded forces that were supplied across a relatively short sea route from Alexandria and Port Said, just several hundred miles away. Every week, his divisions received fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and fresh soldiers to replace casualties. His supply line, while never entirely free from enemy interference, remained fundamentally secure. Rommel, by contrast, was now operating at the very edge of the possible. His convoys across the Mediterranean had become death runs, targeted ceaselessly by British submarine wolf packs and by the airfields of Malta, which had by this point received enough reinforcement and supplies to resume its role as a thorn in Axis shipping. The last 1,000 miles of his supply chain were stretched across the empty desert, and the trucks that made that journey were burning fuel simply to deliver fuel. What took place at El Alamein, therefore, was not a battle won by Montgomery's sudden tactical genius, though he was certainly a competent commander. It was a battle won by the cumulative weight of everything that had come before. British factories in Birmingham and Manchester, working round the clock. American industrial capacity, now fully mobilized and sending tanks and vehicles and ammunition across the Atlantic to Britain, which then forwarded them to Egypt. Canadian foundries and South African mines. The entire empire of supply, now finally oriented toward a single point on the map. Montgomery had perhaps 30,000 more men than Rommel when the fighting began in late August. He had twice as many tanks, and his tanks were being replaced faster than they could be lost. He had 4 times the artillery. His men received regular food rations while German and Italian soldiers were learning to make do with less and less. When an artillery piece broke down in the British lines, it was repaired or replaced within days. When a panzer tank was damaged beyond immediate field repair, there was no workshop in the desert that could truly restore it, and no ship available to bring a replacement across the Mediterranean. The mathematics were becoming relentless. The first attack, which opened in the night of August 31st, saw Rommel attempt one final offensive maneuver, pushing south around the British flank in a move that had worked before, in earlier months, when his mobility and his audacity had compensated for his disadvantages. But Montgomery had anticipated the move, or at least he had prepared for whatever maneuver Rommel might attempt, and the attack was contained within the first night. German forces gained little ground and lost trucks and fuel that they could not replace. The offensive was called off after 36 hours. For the first time in the Desert War, an aggressive Rommel thrust had been stopped not by superior enemy tactics, but by the simple fact that there was not enough fuel to sustain it. What followed was a period of stalemate. Montgomery, methodical and unhurried, built up his forces even further. He created depots of supplies deep in the rear, hidden from air attack. He positioned spare ammunition and fuel and medical supplies in layers of redundancy, so that no single loss could cripple the whole. He rehearsed his attack plan with his officers and soldiers until it became almost mechanical in its precision. And while he waited, Rommel grew weaker. Every day that passed without a successful Axis supply convoy meant fewer gallons in the fuel tanks, fewer shells in the ammunition magazines, fewer opportunities to strike back before his resources were exhausted entirely. When the second battle finally began, in the second week of October, it was Montgomery who attacked, and he attacked with an overwhelming concentration of force at a single point in the line. The Germans and Italians were pushed back, not by the brilliance of the maneuver, but by its sheer weight. The British advance was slow and methodical, grinding forward like a great stone roller, and there was nothing in Rommel's arsenal that could stop it. He had no reserves of fuel for a counterthrust. He had no supply of fresh tanks to plug the gaps in his line. He had only the deteriorating vehicles and the exhausted men that he had brought to this place, and they were being worn away day by day. What is remarkable, perhaps, is how little of the fighting itself is remembered, compared to the enormous logistical truths that governed it. Students of military history often find themselves reading accounts of El Alamein that focus on brigade-level maneuvers, on particular regiments that advanced or held or retreated. These accounts are not wrong, exactly, but they sometimes miss the larger point. The battle was decided long before the first shot was fired, decided in the factories and shipyards and administrative offices where men in uniforms calculated tonnage and schedules and the rate at which fuel could be delivered to the desert. Rommel himself seems to have understood this, at least by the end. In his letters and in his later memoirs, he spoke with a kind of quiet bitterness about the supply situation, about the way that his own tactical brilliance and the courage of his soldiers were being steadily strangled by the simple fact of distance and tonnage and time. He could not, he wrote, fight against geography and mathematics. He could only slow down the inevitable. By the end of October, the line had been broken. The British breakthrough, which had seemed so difficult to achieve while the fighting was ongoing, began to look in retrospect almost inevitable. Rommel, understanding that further resistance was futile, began the long retreat westward, back across the ground that he had covered so quickly in the previous year. But this time, there would be no turning back. This time, the supply lines had finally become fatal. The desert, which had seemed so vast and so full of possibility in the spring of 1941, had become a prison from which there was no escape. And so the arithmetic of defeat began to write itself across the desert floor in a language made of empty fuel cans and silent engines. By late October of 1942, after Montgomery's breakthrough at El Alamein had cracked the Axis line, Rommel found himself facing a mathematics that no tactical brilliance could solve. The British Eighth Army, reinforced and methodical, pressed westward day after day. The German forces, meanwhile, were learning a harder lesson than any they had encountered in the previous 18 months of North African campaigning. It was not the tanks that were surrendering, it was the supply lines themselves, stretched now to the breaking point and then past it, into failure. The retreat that followed was not a swift withdrawal, it was something slower and more agonizing, a gradual compression of possibility, mile by mile, as fuel allocations shrank and repair depots fell into enemy hands. Those who survived it, both the men who drove and those who commanded them, described it less as a military operation than as a slow strangulation, a narrowing of choices until there were almost none left. Picture, if you will, the sprawling motor pools and staging areas that had once supported the German advance. Truck parks filled with vehicles waiting for fuel that no longer came. Maintenance shops where mechanics, working in the heat without adequate supplies, attempted repairs that could no longer be completed because parts were not being shipped. The gasoline that had once been measured in abundant weekly allocations was now rationed in pints. Commanders made decisions no commander wishes to make: which vehicles would move and which would be abandoned. This was the deeper grammar of desert war that had been encoded in the supply situation all along. In November, as the retreat accelerated, the Germans began the systematic destruction of equipment that could not be transported. Tanks too damaged to move were blown in place. Trucks that had exhausted their usefulness were set on fire to prevent their capture. Ammunition that could not be carried was dumped or detonated. And with each explosion, each pillar of black smoke rising from the desert floor, the fighting strength of the Afrika Korps diminished not from British shell fire, but from the simple unavailability of the means to transport it westward. The convoys that still made the journey from Tripoli and Benghazi were now running under constant aerial harassment. The British had established air superiority more thoroughly than at any previous moment in the campaign. Messerschmitts could no longer reliably contest the skies. Supply columns moved at night when possible, and even then, losses mounted. It was not uncommon for a convoy to depart Tripoli with 15 trucks and arrive at the forward depots with 9. The mathematics of loss had become so familiar that it no longer produced the shock of catastrophe, only the dull weight of predictability. Rommel himself, watching the retreat, recognized with a clarity that bordered on despair that the situation had become irretrievable. He had understood, from the very beginning of the campaign, that logistics would be the true determinant of success or failure. He had warned Berlin repeatedly about the inadequacy of supply shipments. He had requested more tonnage, more ships, more air cover for the convoys. What he had received, with melancholy regularity, were assurances and promises that were never quite fulfilled. And now, as the Eighth Army pressed westward, those abstract warnings had crystallized into concrete failure. The retreat itself became a sort of slow-motion study in how defeat actually unfolds when resources have been exhausted. It is not dramatic in many ways. There are moments of action, brief engagements where Axis forces held defensible positions and inflicted casualties on their pursuers. But between those moments lay the long, grinding hours of movement without adequate fuel, of repairs conducted with improvised materials, of decisions made under the assumption that the next supply shipment would not arrive in time, because, increasingly, it did not. Water rations for the men became a central preoccupation. The cooling systems of vehicles in the desert heat required enormous quantities of water. So did the human body. As the retreat lengthened, as distances increased between fuel depots and water points, the choices became starkly binary. More water for the engines meant less for drinking. More fuel for movement meant less for heating, for cooking, for the small comforts that kept men from breaking entirely under the psychological weight of continuous retreat. The Italian forces, already depleted and exhausted, began to fragment more noticeably. Italian truck drivers and maintenance crews, many of whom had volunteered years earlier for what seemed like a campaign of conquest, now found themselves in the machinery of collapse. Supply depots that had once bustled with organized activity became scenes of grim efficiency. Men loading what could be moved, destroying what could not, working with the understanding that the enemy was advancing and soon these places too would be captured. Consider for a moment the depots themselves. Tripoli, that great prize that had seemed so important when it fell to Axis forces in February 1941, was now becoming a place of departure rather than arrival. Supply officers worked with inventory lists that grew shorter each week. The harbour, which had once been a bottleneck limiting what could be imported, was now emptying because there was little time left to unload ships before the advance of the British forces rendered the port unusable. It was as if the entire campaign was being reversed at increasing speed, a film running backward toward its own beginning. By December, the Axis forces had retreated nearly to Benghazi. The journey that had taken them months to accomplish in the opposite direction, from Tripoli eastward toward Egypt, was being undone in weeks. The fuel consumption of the retreat was itself a form of defeat. Every litre burned in withdrawal was a litre not available for future operations. Every vehicle abandoned or destroyed was productive capacity lost forever. What might be called the arithmetic of defeat was fundamentally a mathematics of depletion. The Axis could not manufacture tanks, aircraft or trucks fast enough to replace losses. The supply convoys from Italy could not deliver enough fuel to sustain operations at the scale they were being conducted. The distances involved, 1,000 miles from Tripoli to the Egyptian border, had always been too great for the logistical infrastructure available. Rommel had known this. His superiors in Berlin had known this, or should have, but knowing and acting upon that knowledge are different things, and by late 1942, the moment for meaningful action had passed. The retreat continued through the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943. Supply depots fell one after another, Benghazi in December, then the smaller ports and fuel storage points that dotted the coast. With each loss, the problem of supplying the remaining forces became geometrically more severe. As the Axis lines shortened, one might think that supply becomes easier. The distance from the port to the front decreases. But the British, understanding this perfectly well, were accelerating their pressure precisely to prevent Axis forces from establishing new, shorter lines of supply. It was in these months that the reality of the North African campaign revealed itself most clearly. The Desert Fox, as Rommel had been styled in the British press and in popular imagination, had not been defeated by a cleverer opponent or a bolder maneuver. He had been defeated by the simple fact that the machinery of war, the vast industrial apparatus that produces fuel, vehicles, ammunition, food, and all the thousand necessities of modern combat, had never been aligned in his favor. The British, by contrast, controlled supplies from halfway around the world. Their factories continued to produce replacements for losses. Their shipping, though harassed and diminished, was sufficient to sustain operations at the scale they required. The long retreat, then, was not a failure of tactics or will. It was the inevitable consequence of strategic choices made years earlier, in the boardrooms and planning offices of Berlin and Rome. The decision to commit forces to North Africa without the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain them. The decision to rely on Italian shipping and industrial capacity when neither was adequate to the task. The decision to fight 1,000 miles from one's primary bases of supply, with only the Mediterranean, a sea that could not be held, as the avenue of resupply. And as the desert gave way, mile by mile, to British control, the silence of the retreating columns was profound. Not the silence of defeat in battle, which has a kind of finality to it, but the silence of a slow unwinding, a gradual recognition that the game had been decided long before the final moves were made. The supply lines had failed. Everything that followed from that failure was merely its expression in geographic terms. By the autumn of 1942, the ink on the maps of North Africa had begun to fade in a way that no amount of German or Italian wishful thinking could restore. Rommel, exhausted and increasingly isolated in his command, knew something that the arithmetic of supply chains had already whispered to anyone patient enough to listen. The game, as they say, was up, not because of a single catastrophic battle or a dramatic reversal of tactics, but because the mathematics of distance and tonnage had simply ceased to permit victory. And now, as American and British forces pressed westward and eastward respectively, the great pincers began their inevitable closing. The Americans, having landed in Morocco and Algeria in November of 1942, advanced with a slow and methodical caution that frustrated some of their commanders, but reflected the hard logic of logistics. They too understood, or were learning to understand, that an army moves on supply, not on courage alone. To the east, Montgomery's Eighth Army pursued the Axis forces with a deliberation that appeared glacial to the impatient, but which was, in reality, the pace of a military machine that refused to outrun its own arteries. The two armies, one coming from the west, one from the east, were drawing closer with each passing week and month, and there was no escape route left. The sea was closed, the air above was increasingly hostile, the desert behind offered only abandonment. By early 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa found themselves compressed into an ever-shrinking corner of Tunisia. Tunis and Bizerte, the last great ports still in German and Italian hands, became the final desperate lifeline. But the convoys crossing the Mediterranean had become a nightmare. The Luftwaffe's grip on air superiority, so briefly held in the early months of 1942, had slipped away entirely. British fighters from Malta, American fighters from advancing airfields, and the expanding naval presence of the Allies made every voyage a gamble, measured in lost ships and burned fuel. The Italian Navy, once conceived as the master of the Mediterranean, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The merchant fleet, so vital to the entire edifice of Axis ambition in Africa, was being sunk faster than replacements could be built or borrowed. Inside the shrinking perimeter, conditions had become almost medieval in their desperation. Supply depots that had once held reserves measured in months now held supplies measured in days. Water became a currency more precious than money. Fuel was rationed so severely that vehicles often sat idle, waiting for the few gallons needed to move them a few miles further toward the final collapse. The German and Italian soldiers, many of them far from home, dug into defensive positions that everyone knew could not be held. There was a grim, almost resigned quality to these final preparations. The generals knew the numbers. The soldiers, having survived months of the desert's grinding attrition, knew them too. Rommel himself had departed North Africa in early 1943, claiming illness and seeking to influence Hitler directly to authorize a withdrawal. In his absence, command fell to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, a competent officer who nevertheless inherited an impossible situation. Von Arnim attempted to consolidate the forces and organize a last stand, but there was almost nothing left to stand with. The vast distances that had favored the defender in an open desert now offered no advantage in a compressed corner of Tunisia. There was nowhere to maneuver, no supply lines to stretch and break, no sweeping flanks to turn. The American forces, advancing from the west, moved through mountains and hills that slowed their advance but nonetheless pressed the Axis positions. The British and Commonwealth forces, driving from the east, engaged the Afrika Korps in what would be among the final major engagements of the campaign. These battles, fought in the rough country of northeastern Tunisia, lack the epic scale of El Alamein or the symbolic weight of earlier clashes, yet they were no less bitter. Men died in defensive positions that everyone knew would not be held, for reasons that had more to do with military honor and the reluctance to surrender than with any realistic hope of altering the outcome. By May of 1943, the Axis position had crumbled into fragments. Tunis fell to advancing British forces. Bizerte, the last great port, surrendered shortly after. Von Arnim himself was captured. Across the shrinking perimeter, Axis units laid down their weapons or attempted desperate, doomed escapes across the Mediterranean. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity. The remaining ships attempting to evacuate personnel were sunk. The final Axis soldiers to leave Africa either died in the attempt or never left at all. If you were to ask a logistics officer what had defeated the Afrika Korps in Tunisia, he would not point to a map or a battle report. He would instead direct you to the accounting books, to the manifests of ships lost and supplies burned, to the calculations of daily consumption versus daily delivery. The collapse in Tunisia was not a surprise emerging from the smoke of battle. It was the inevitable conclusion of an equation that had been running the wrong direction since the summer of 1942, perhaps since the very beginning, when a small German force had landed in Libya with ambitions that exceeded its means. What had truly strangled the Axis position was not a single dramatic moment, but rather the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller failures, each one invisible at the moment, but cumulative in their effect. A convoy sunk by aircraft from Malta, a fuel truck destroyed by a British air raid, a ship damaged in a storm and unable to make the voyage, sandstorm that delayed loading at Tripoli, an engine failure on a desert road, a submarine patrol that found an Italian merchant vessel in the wrong place at the right moment. Each incident, minor in isolation, conspired to create a deficit that grew and compounded and eventually became irreversible. The geography that had seemed so vast and empty during the early years of the campaign became a suffocating prison in the final months. The Mediterranean that separated North Africa from Axis sources of supply became, for all practical purposes, an impassable barrier. The British blockade and interdiction campaign, grown ever more sophisticated and relentless, had made the logistics equation finally and fatally unbalanced. The Italian navy and merchant fleet, worn down by years of attrition, could no longer protect or move the supplies that were supposed to sustain the Axis war in Africa. In the end, Tunisia witnessed not so much a military defeat as a mathematical conclusion. The Axis had run out of numbers, they had run out of ships, they had run out of fuel, they had run out of supplies, and having run out of all of these things, they had no choice but to run out of Africa itself. The desert had never been conquered. It had merely been occupied, imperfectly and temporarily, by an army that had finally discovered what logistics officers had known from the beginning, that supply lines, like armies, must eventually find their limit, and when they do, all the tactical brilliance and military courage in the world cannot compensate for the arithmetic of defeat. The soldiers in those prisoner of war camps, thousands of them Italian, thousands of them German, had become living testimonies to the true nature of the battle that had been fought across North Africa. It was not a battle won by superior tactics or brilliant generalship, though both sides possessed officers of considerable talent. It was a battle won by the patient, grinding work of men who built and maintained supply lines, who fought to protect convoys, who calculated tonnages and fuel requirements with the precision of engineers and accountants. It was won by those who understood that war, in the end, is not romantic or glorious, but rather a contest in logistics, in production capacity, in the ability to deliver 10 tons of supply where the enemy could deliver only 8, and then deliver 9 where the enemy could deliver 5, until the mathematics had so thoroughly favored one side that the outcome became inevitable. And so we return, at last, to the silence of the desert itself. The machines have stopped. The engines that roared across those endless plains for nearly 3 years have fallen quiet. The sand, which buried so many ambitions and so many men, settles once more into its ancient rhythms, undisturbed and unconcerned with the brief violence that moved across its surface. What was the Afrika Korps, in the end, but a creature born of contradiction, a force of remarkable tactical brilliance, commanded by a man of genuine courage and vision, yet sentenced from its very first day by mathematics that no general, no matter how gifted, could overcome. Rommel understood the desert. He understood movement. He understood the art of deception and the power of concentrated force delivered at the moment of decision. But the desert, it turned out, understood something far more fundamental, that an army cannot eat speed, and that supplies do not move on will alone. Consider the arithmetic that governed those years. A single panzer division, and we speak here of those magnificent machines, the tanks that struck fear into British crews and dominated every tactical engagement they entered. A single panzer division required approximately 300 tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies every single day just to remain in existence, not to advance, not to attack, simply to exist in that landscape. Now multiply that across the forces that Rommel commanded at his peak, across the Italian formations that depended on German coordination, across all the trucks and personnel carriers and field kitchens and ammunition dumps and water points scattered across 1,000 miles of North African territory. The numbers grew vast very quickly. They grew faster than any convoy could travel, faster than any port could unload, faster than any supply officer could dream of satisfying. The great irony, and perhaps it is the most important one to hold in mind as we consider this entire campaign, is that the Afrika Korps never truly lost a battle in the classical sense until they had already been defeated. Their tactical skill remained formidable even in their darkest hours. But tactics, no matter how flawless, become irrelevant when the fuel tank runs dry, when the ammunition magazines hold their last rounds, when the water ration shrinks below what a man needs to survive in heat that approaches 50 degrees Celsius. These were not failures of courage or imagination. They were failures of distance and tonnage and time. Think of those Italian convoys making their slow journey across the Mediterranean, targets for every British submarine prowling those waters, for every RAF pilot flying out from Malta, for every surface raider that could be spared from other theatres. Think of the men aboard those ships, the ordinary sailors, many of them conscripts with no love for fascism, no stake in this distant campaign, simply doing their duty and hoping to see home again. Many never did. The sea, too, became a theatre of attrition, and each ship lost meant not a dramatic explosion that would be remembered or commemorated, but the quiet erasure of thousands of tons of supplies that would never reach the desert. The loss accumulated silently, invisibly, in the form of shortages that manifest days or weeks later as a halt in momentum, as an offensive postponed, as an advance abandoned. And behind those numbers, in the quartermaster tents and the supply depots and the harbour facilities, stood people whose names history has not preserved. Italian dock workers loading ammunition crates in the sun. German truck drivers steering enormous vehicles across terrain that seemed determined to shred every vehicle it touched. Engineers calculating consumption rates and trying, always failing, to widen the gap between what was needed and what could be provided. These were not grand figures. They made no dramatic decisions. They fought no visible battles. Yet they were, in a profound sense, the true battlefield. The war was won or lost, not in the clash of armour, but in the slower, quieter struggle of logistics, in the accumulated effect of small shortages that became large ones, in the inexorable mathematics of consumption outpacing supply. It bears dwelling on, this thought, as sleep begins to drift across consciousness. Rommel himself understood this, at least by the end. His later letters reveal a man increasingly tormented not by his enemies, but by the impossible equation he had been asked to solve. How does one make something from nothing? How does one sustain an offensive when the lifelines that feed it become thinner and thinner? How does one command men to attack when ammunition is rationed and fuel is measured in days rather than weeks? The desert teaches hard lessons, and perhaps the hardest of all is that genius cannot transcend supply. The campaign ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with a slow hemorrhage. The Axis forces retreated across the very ground they had once advanced to take. They abandoned vehicles along the route, tanks with empty fuel tanks, trucks that had simply broken down under the punishment of sand and heat and endless kilometers. The retreat itself became a ghostly mirror of the advance, a backward journey across territory already devastated and stripped of resources. And as they withdrew, they left behind not just military hardware, but the physical evidence of a civilization that had overreached itself, that had tried to stretch supply lines across too much distance, across a landscape too vast and indifferent to care about human purposes. In Tunisia, finally, it ended. The Axis forces surrounded, their supplies exhausted, their reinforcements cut off by an enemy who had, by that point, achieved both material and logistical superiority. The surrender was not celebrated as a great military victory, in quite the way that other battles were, but it was, perhaps, the most decisive victory of all. It proved something fundamental, that an army's reach cannot exceed the distance its supplies can travel, that momentum, no matter how thrilling in the moment, must ultimately submit to arithmetic, that the desert, in the end, protects itself by a simple and elegant mathematics that defeats all comers equally. What remains now, if one were to walk across those spaces, though few do, for the desert remains as indifferent and harsh today as it was then, what remains is scattered metal, rust slowly claiming what men built, tank hulks half buried in sand, the ghosts of supply depots long since erased, and the silence, the profound, encompassing silence that has no memory, no judgment, no awareness of the brief turmoil that moved across its surface. The desert abides. It will swallow all ambition, all hope, all brilliance, and render it into sand. The Afrika Korps was not defeated by a superior general, though Montgomery was competent enough. It was not defeated by better tactics or superior courage. It was defeated by the slow, inevitable mathematics of distance and time.